Case 1. Antoinette Frank. She seemed like someone who wanted to make a difference. At 24 years old, Antoinette Frank wore the badge of the New Orleans Police Department with apparent pride. She worked security shifts at the Kim On restaurant in New Orleans East to supplement her police salary, becoming a familiar face to the Vietnamese family who owned it. The Vus trusted her. Officer Ronald Williams, her 25-year-old colleague who also moonlighted at the restaurant, trusted her. That trust would cost them their lives. Antoinette Frank joined the NOPD in early 1993 during one of the department's darkest periods. The force was chronically short-handed, bleeding officers faster than it could replace them. Pay was lower than in similarly sized cities, and morale had cratered after several high-profile arrests of officers for murder and drug activity. The department was desperate for bodies in uniform. That desperation would prove deadly. Frank's application should have ended in rejection. She was caught lying on several sections of her employment application. She failed 2 standard psychiatric evaluations. Psychiatrist Philip Scuria explicitly advised against hiring her. But the NOPD gave her a second chance to apply, and this time she slipped through. The warnings were ignored. The red flags were buried under the weight of staffing needs. Antoinette Frank became a New Orleans police officer, equipped with a gun, a badge, and the authority of the law. By early 1995, Frank had become close with Rogers Lacaze, a drug dealer she'd met in her district. Lacaze was her probable lover, and their relationship was anything but professional. Frank believed the owners of the Kim On were shortchanging her on hours and pay. She wanted revenge. But more than that, she wanted money. On the night of March 4th, 1995, she decided to take it. Around 11 o'clock p.m., Frank and Lacaze entered the Kim On restaurant. Officer Ronald Williams was working his security shift, sitting in the dining area. Ha Quang Vu, 17, and his brother Quoc Vu, 24, were working the restaurant. Chow Vu, a family member, was also present. What happened next was captured in witness testimony and later confirmed through forensic evidence. Frank and Lacaze weren't there to eat. They were there to rob. The two split up inside the restaurant. Frank opened fire on Officer Williams, her fellow NOPD officer, shooting him in the back of the head as he sat in a chair. He died instantly. Lacaze moved through the restaurant, hunting down the Vu brothers. Ha Quang Vu was shot and killed. Quoc Vu was shot and killed. The execution-style murders were swift and cold. Chow Vu, hearing the gunshots, ran to the kitchen's walk-in cooler and hid. From inside the freezer, she listened as footsteps moved through the restaurant. She stayed silent. She stayed alive. Frank and Lacaze ransacked the restaurant, taking money and whatever valuables they could find. Then they left. The bodies of 3 people lay in the dining area and kitchen. Blood pooled on the floors. The cooler door remained closed. Minutes later, Chow Vu emerged from the freezer and called 911. Police were dispatched to the scene, and then something extraordinary happened. Antoinette Frank returned to the Kim On restaurant, arriving in a police patrol car wearing her NOPD uniform. She walked into the crime scene she had just created and pretended to be a responding officer. She surveyed the bodies. She moved through the restaurant, and then she approached Chow Vu, the woman who had hidden in the freezer, and asked her what had happened. Chow looked at the woman in the uniform and said the words that would seal Frank's fate. "You saw what happened. You killed my brother and sister." Frank was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Lacaze was arrested and charged later that night. At police headquarters, Frank confessed to the crimes. She was believed to be the first New Orleans police officer to have been charged with killing a fellow officer. Her trial began on September 5, 1995. Although Frank's attorneys had subpoenaed 39 witnesses, they didn't call a single one. The evidence was overwhelming. Chow Vu's testimony was damning. The forensic evidence was airtight. On September 12, 1995, the jury needed only 22 minutes to return a guilty verdict on all counts. At the time, it was a record for a capital murder case in New Orleans. The next day, the jury needed only 45 minutes to recommend the death penalty. She was formally sentenced to death on October 20, 1995, and sent to death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, near Baton Rouge. Lacaze was also convicted and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later overturned due to intellectual disability. The story didn't end there. In 1993, a year and a half before the murders at the Kim On, Frank's father had stayed at her home for a time before she reported him missing. In November 1995, just 1 month after she received her first death sentence, a dog led police to find a human skull with a bullet hole buried under Frank's house. Police and prosecutors believed that the skull was that of Adam Frank and that Antoinette murdered him. Frank is also believed to have killed her father, who had repeatedly raped her as a child. However, since she is already on death row for the Kim On murders, authorities have made no serious effort to try her for her father's death. Antoinette Frank remains on Louisiana's death row, the only woman on the state's death row. She has been incarcerated since 1995. Her case has been appealed multiple times, with her attorneys arguing she was denied state-funded experts to help prepare for the sentencing phase of the trial. They introduced testimony from psychiatrists who said possible traumatic events in Frank's childhood could have affected her behavior at the time of the murders. The courts have consistently rejected these appeals. The Kim On murders devastated the Vu family and shocked the New Orleans community. Officer Ronald Williams left behind family and friends who mourned a young man dedicated to serving his city. In 2018, the city of New Orleans settled a lawsuit with the families. The case became a symbol of the NOPD's institutional failures during the 1990s. Frank had been hired despite clear warning signs. Supervisors ignored psychiatric evaluations. The desperation for officers overrode basic safety protocols, and 3 people paid with their lives. Frank's case also exposed the corrupting influence of relationships between officers and the criminals they were supposed to police. Her connection to Rogers Lacaze blurred the line between law enforcement and lawlessness. She used her badge not to protect, but to prey. She used her position of trust not to serve, but to steal. And when she was caught, she showed no remorse. Investigator Eddie Rance, who interviewed Frank, described her as the most cold-hearted person he had ever encountered in 3 decades as an officer. What made the case stand out was the sheer audacity. Frank didn't just commit murder. She returned to the scene in uniform, walked past the bodies of the people she had just killed, and asked a survivor what had happened. It was an act of such brazen arrogance that it defied comprehension. She believed she could get away with it. She believed the badge would protect her. The fallout from Frank's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. The NOPD was forced to confront its hiring practices and internal corruption. The case became a cautionary tale about what happens when desperation overrides diligence, when staffing shortages lead to fatal compromises. Frank's crimes didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because a system failed, and that failure enabled a predator to wear a badge. Even today, the name Antoinette Frank remains a dark chapter in New Orleans law enforcement history. She sits on death row, her appeals exhausted, her life sentence stretching toward an execution that has been delayed for decades. The Vu family will never recover their loved ones. Officer Ronald Williams will never return home. And the city of New Orleans still grapples with the scars left by officers who betrayed their oaths, their colleagues, and their communities. Case 2, Len Davis. Len Davis wore a badge for the New Orleans Police Department, but he operated more like a crime boss. By 1994, the 30-year-old officer had built an empire of corruption that stretched across the city's cocaine trade. He didn't arrest drug dealers. He extorted them. He didn't uphold the law. He enforced his own rules with violence and intimidation. And when a 32-year-old mother of three named Kim Groves dared to file a complaint against him, he made sure she would never testify. Davis had been with the NOPD long enough to understand how the system worked, and more importantly, how it failed. His internal affairs file was, as one officer described it, as thick as a phone book. Complaint after complaint had been filed against him over the years. Citizens accused him of brutality, abuse of power, and misconduct. But supervisors swept his dirt under the rug, pushing problems aside rather than confronting them. Davis learned he was untouchable. He learned the badge protected him. And he used that knowledge to build a criminal enterprise that would eventually involve more than 20 New Orleans police officers. In 1994, an FBI sting operation was closing in on Davis. Undercover agents had caught him enforcing a protection racket upon the city's cocaine dealers. Davis had been extorting money from a drug dealer who, unbeknownst to him, was an FBI informant. The operation revealed a sprawling conspiracy. 9 other police officers, including 2 who would later testify against Davis, were indicted for being part of the criminal network. 20 additional NOPD officers were implicated in the scheme. But before the FBI could complete their investigation and make arrests, something happened that forced them to act immediately. On October 13, 1994, Davis was patrolling the streets when he saw a young man he believed was involved in the shooting of a police officer. The teenager was not the suspect Davis thought he was, but that didn't stop Davis from confronting him. Davis pulled over, got out of his patrol car, and began beating the 17-year-old boy. He struck him repeatedly, using his fists and his authority to deliver what he saw as street justice. The beating was brutal, the boy was terrified, and someone was watching. Kim Groves, a 32-year-old local resident and mother of 3 young children, witnessed the assault from her neighborhood. She saw an NOPD officer savagely beating a teenager who wasn't resisting. She saw the abuse of power happening in broad daylight, and she decided to do something about it. Kim Groves filed a complaint with the New Orleans Police Department. She gave her name. She told what she had seen. She believed the system would protect her for doing the right thing. Davis was tipped off about the complaint by another officer. Within hours, he knew that Kim Groves had filed a report against him. He knew where she lived, and he knew what he had to do. Davis didn't go to Groves himself. Instead, he turned to Paul Hardy, a local drug dealer with whom he had a working relationship. Davis conspired with Hardy to kill Kim Groves. The plan was set in motion less than 24 hours after she filed her complaint. On October 14, 1994, Paul Hardy carried out the hit. He shot and killed Kim Groves as she stood outside her home. Steve Jackson drove Hardy away from the scene. A 4th man, Damon Causey, participated in the planning of the murder and later hid the murder weapon, a 9mm pistol. Kim Groves died less than 1 day after she had filed her complaint against Len Davis. Her 3 young children lost their mother. Her family lost a daughter, a sister, a loved one. And the city of New Orleans lost a woman who had the courage to stand up against police brutality. The FBI investigation into Davis had already been underway when Groves was murdered. The shooting forced investigators to abort their broader probe into the narcotics conspiracy and focus on bringing Davis to justice for her death. The evidence was damning. Davis was arrested and charged with conspiracy to violate Kim Groves' civil rights through murder and witness tampering. The case was prosecuted in federal court, where the stakes were higher and the evidence mounted quickly. Davis was convicted in 1996 on 2 federal civil rights charges for directing Hardy to murder Groves and for witness tampering. On April 26, 1996, Davis was sentenced to death, becoming the first on-duty police officer to be sentenced to death for federal civil rights violations. In December 1996, he was sentenced to an additional life in prison plus 5 years for his involvement in the cocaine ring in which other NOPD officers had participated. The other officers pleaded guilty. Davis maintained he had done nothing wrong. Paul Hardy was convicted of conspiracy to violate Groves' civil rights and of witness tampering, though the witness tampering conviction would later be overturned. He was initially sentenced to death, but in 2011 his sentence was commuted to life when he was found by a judge to be intellectually disabled. Damon Causey was convicted of federal conspiracy charges and of violating Groves' civil rights. He was sentenced to life imprisonment after rejecting a plea bargain that would have given him 6 to 9 years in prison. His conviction was upheld on appeal. Davis spent the next 28 years on federal death row. He lost his final appeal in October 2021. It appeared that his execution was inevitable. But on December 23, 2024, outgoing President Joe Biden granted sentence commutations to 37 of the 40 inmates on federal death row. Len Davis was among them. His death sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then something extraordinary happened. 1 week later, Davis and fellow former death row inmate Shannon Agofsky filed a motion to block the commutation. Davis, in a handwritten pleading filed in an Indiana federal court, wrote that Biden was forcing an unconstitutional life sentence on him. Prisoner Davis did not request any commutation, nor does he accept any commutation, he wrote. Davis was demanding that a federal judge reinstate the death penalty that a jury had leveled against him nearly 3 decades earlier. The motion was rejected. Davis would serve life in prison whether he wanted the commutation or not. The story of Len Davis doesn't end with Kim Groves' murder. In the years following his conviction, a far darker truth began to emerge. Investigators discovered that Davis had framed multiple innocent people for murders they did not commit. In October 2022, 3 men, Burnell Juluke Jr., Leroy Nelson, and Kunta Gable, were released from prison after 28 years of incarceration. They had been wrongfully convicted of the August 22, 1994, murder of 19-year-old Rondell Santinac, based on false testimony from Len Davis. Davis himself is now believed to have committed that murder. 2 months earlier, in 2022, Dwayne LeBlanc was released from prison after 24 years. His convictions for second-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder were overturned after he pleaded guilty to lesser charges. LeBlanc said he was living in California, over 2,000 miles away, when the murder occurred. He was the man Davis had originally been searching for when he beat the 17-year-old boy, the beating that Kim Groves had witnessed and reported. In December 2022, another man, Sherman Singleton, was released from prison after 32 years. He had been convicted of the August 8, 1990 murder of Bruce Vappy based on false testimony from Len Davis. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and walked free. The pattern was clear. Davis had not only murdered Kim Groves, he had systematically framed innocent people for crimes they did not commit, sending them to prison for decades, while the real perpetrators, possibly including himself, walked free. The total damage is staggering. 3 men served a combined 84 years for a murder Davis likely committed. 2 other men served a combined 56 years for murders they say they did not commit. All were victims of Len Davis's corruption. All were casualties of a system that allowed one officer to operate with impunity for years. In 2018, the city of New Orleans settled a lawsuit with Kim Groves' 3 children for $1.5 million. It was a financial acknowledgement of what the city had allowed to happen, but no amount of money could return their mother. The Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office has undertaken a systemic review of criminal cases touched by Davis. The corruption ran deep, the lies were pervasive, and the consequences extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Davis epitomized a dark period for the New Orleans Police Department, one marked by corruption and rampant violence. Antoinette Frank, another former NOPD officer from the same era, remains on Louisiana's death row. The two officers operated in the same broken system, a system that enabled predators to wear badges and prey on the communities they were supposed to protect. What made Davis's case particularly chilling was the casual brutality with which he operated. He didn't hesitate to order a hit on a civilian who filed a complaint. He didn't think twice about framing innocent people for murders. He treated his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a license to commit crimes with impunity. And for years, the system protected him. Supervisors ignored the complaints. Fellow officers tipped him off to investigations. The internal affairs file grew thicker, but nothing changed. The murder of Kim Groves was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of unchecked corruption. When officers learn they can beat teenagers without consequences, they learn they can do worse. When they see their misconduct files buried under bureaucratic indifference, they learn the rules don't apply to them. And when they operate in a culture that prizes loyalty over accountability, they learn that even murder can be justified if it protects the brotherhood. Kim Groves paid the ultimate price for believing the system would protect her. She filed a complaint against a corrupt officer, and she was killed for it less than 24 hours later. Her children grew up without a mother. Her family lived with the knowledge that doing the right thing had cost them everything. And the city of New Orleans was forced to confront the fact that one of its own police officers had become a murderer. Len Davis sits in federal prison today, serving life without the possibility of parole. He will never leave. He will die behind bars. But the damage he inflicted extends far beyond his own incarceration. The wrongfully convicted men who lost decades of their lives, the families torn apart by his lies, the community's shattered trust in law enforcement, the legacy of corruption that still haunts the NOPD. These are the ripples of one officer's crimes spreading outward and touching countless lives. Davis' demand to have his death sentence reinstated remains one of the strangest footnotes in the case. Most inmates fight to avoid execution. Davis fought to have it restored. Whether it was a legal strategy, a death wish, or something else entirely, the courts rejected his motion. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell, and the families of his victims will spend the rest of their lives living with what he took from them. The case raises difficult questions about how law enforcement polices itself. How many complaints does it take before an officer is removed? How many warning signs must be ignored before tragedy becomes inevitable? And what happens when the people tasked with protecting us become the very threat we need protection from? Len Davis answered those questions with blood and betrayal. And the city of New Orleans is still reckoning with the consequences. Case 3. Manuel Pardo. Manuel Pardo believed he was a soldier fighting a war. The enemy, in his mind, was the drug culture poisoning South Florida. The battlefield was the streets of Miami-Dade County, and his weapon of choice was a 9mm pistol that he used to execute 9 people over the course of 92 days in early 1986. Pardo wasn't fighting crime. He was committing it. But in his twisted logic, every murder was a mission accomplished, every victim a casualty in his personal crusade. He kept trophies. He kept a diary. And when he finally stood before a jury, he asked them to give him the glory of death. Manuel Manny Pardo, Jr. was born in New York on September 24, 1956. On paper, his early life looked promising. He was a former Boy Scout and a Marine Corps veteran who had served his country with distinction. In the 1970s, he joined the Florida Highway Patrol and graduated valedictorian from the academy. He was sharp, disciplined, and driven. He seemed like the model law enforcement officer. But cracks in the facade appeared quickly. In 1979, Pardo was fired from the Florida Highway Patrol for falsifying traffic tickets. The termination should have ended his career in law enforcement. Instead, he was hired by the police department in Sweetwater, a small city in Miami-Dade County. For a few years, Pardo wore the uniform again. He even earned a commendation for his role in a drug bust. But his time in Sweetwater was marked by troubling incidents. In 1981, he was one of 4 Sweetwater officers charged with brutality, though the cases were dismissed. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. In 1985, Pardo flew to the Bahamas to testify at the trial of a Sweetwater colleague accused of drug smuggling. On the stand, Pardo lied, telling the court that he and his colleague were international undercover agents working on a major operation. It was a fabrication. There were no undercover operations. There were no international investigations. Pardo had simply invented a story, and he delivered it under oath. The lie was exposed, and Pardo was fired from the Sweetwater Police Department. By the end of 1985, he was out of law enforcement entirely. But he still had his training. He still had his weapons. And he still had his delusions of righteous purpose. Over a 92-day period in early 1986, Pardo went on a killing spree. His first 2 victims were Mario Amador and Roberto Alfonso, killed during a robbery. Pardo shot them with a .22 caliber Ruger pistol, taking their money and valuables before leaving their bodies behind. Later that month, Pardo killed Michael Milot, a Haitian anti-Duvalier activist who Pardo believed was a police informant. Milot was a gunsmith who had previously supplied Pardo with silencers for his handguns. Pardo's partner from the Sweetwater Police, Rolando Garcia, lured Milot to a car belonging to Pardo's wife. Pardo was already waiting in the back seat. Once Milot sat down in the front passenger seat, Pardo shot him in the head with a 9mm pistol. The car was later discovered to have been reupholstered to hide the blood. In February 1986, Pardo killed Luis Robledo and Ulpiano Ledo during a robbery of their home. The executions were methodical. Pardo took what he wanted and left the bodies. 2 months later, Pardo claimed 4 more victims in 2 separate incidents. Farah Quintero and Sarah Musa were killed over an argument about a pawned ring worth $50 and their refusal to buy Pardo a VCR with stolen credit cards. The murders were as senseless as they were brutal. Pardo shot both women and left them where they fell. The final murders were the most violent. Ramon Alvaro and Daisy Ricard were targeted together. Alvaro was Pardo's intended victim. Ricard was killed simply because she was with him. Pardo shot Ricard once, and then his Ruger pistol jammed. Rather than abandon the attack, Pardo bludgeoned Ricard to death with the handgun. The force of the beating caused the jammed round to discharge into Pardo's own foot. He finished killing Ricard, then dumped her body in a secluded area and left Alvaro's body in the trunk of Alvaro's vehicle. Pardo and Garcia immediately flew to New York, where Pardo received medical treatment for his foot. Pardo was apprehended in a New York City hospital with a gunshot wound that matched the bullets found in his final victims. The injury that led to his capture was self-inflicted during the murder he committed. When police searched Pardo's home in Florida, they discovered a chilling collection of evidence. There were photographs of his victims. There was a diary in which Pardo recounted details of his crimes. There were newspaper clippings about the murders carefully preserved as souvenirs, and there was a collection of Nazi memorabilia. Pardo, it turned out, was a Nazi sympathizer who admired Adolf Hitler and harbored racist and anti-Semitic views regarding Jews and black people. At trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Pardo had targeted his victims as part of a twisted mission to rid Florida of its drug culture. He claimed he was killing drug dealers and buyers to clean up the streets. Most of his victims were indeed involved with drugs in some capacity, but 3 of the 9 victims, Farah Quintero, Sarah Musa, and Daisy Ricard, were women with no involvement in drug dealing. They were killed over petty disputes or simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Pardo's vigilante narrative didn't hold up under scrutiny. He was a murderer who dressed up his crimes in the language of justice. Pardo testified in his own defense, against the advice of his attorneys. He stood before the jury and laid out his philosophy. "I am a soldier. I accomplished my mission, and I humbly ask you to give me the glory of ending my life and not send me to spend the rest of my days in state prison," he told them. He wanted death. He wanted martyrdom. He wanted to be remembered as someone who had taken a stand against the drug trade, even if that stand involved executing 9 people in cold blood. In October 1988, Pardo was found guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder. The jury sentenced him to death. Robert Stone, who led the prosecution, later stated that Pardo was the most sexually deviant person I had ever seen. He made Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. Bill Haggerty, an ex-FBI agent who profiled Pardo for the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, described him as one of the sickest. If I had a list of the top 5, which would include all of the serial killers I have interviewed throughout the country, he would definitely be in the top 5. Pardo spent 26 years on death row. During that time, he maintained his belief that he had done more social good as a killer than he could have done as a police officer. In numerous press interviews, he defended his actions and showed no remorse for the lives he had taken. He filed appeals, but they were rejected. He filed frivolous lawsuits against true crime authors who described him as a serial killer, but those were thrown out of court. Pardo's time in prison was marked by the same arrogance and delusion that had driven him to kill. On December 11, 2012, Florida prepared to execute Manuel Pardo. His attorneys had tried to block the execution by arguing that he was mentally ill, but federal courts declined to intercede. Outside Florida State Prison in Stark, about 45 death penalty protesters gathered in a field. Inside, fewer than 10 family members of the victims were ushered into a small room facing the death chamber. A glass pane separated them from Pardo. At 7:31 p.m., the lethal injection process began. Reporters could not hear Pardo's final statement because of an apparent malfunction in the death chamber's sound system. Prison officials later revealed his last words, "Airborne forever." He also added, "I love you, Michi baby," referring to his daughter. In a one-page letter written before his execution, Pardo made no apology to the families of his victims. Instead, he boasted about his pride in seeing the New York Giants and the Yankees win championships. He delighted in the rival Jets doing what they do best: choke, crash, and burn. They stink. He praised Spain for winning a World Cup title in soccer and urged the country to keep the tradition of bullfighting. Then he claimed to accept the consequences of his actions. Pardo was pronounced dead at 7:47 p.m., about 16 minutes after the lethal injection process began. The witnesses watched as the life drained from him. Frank Judd, the nephew of victim Farah Quintero, read a statement following the execution. He thanked the state of Florida for bringing closure to his family and said the pain they felt about Quintero's murder continues to this day. "Personally, I don't feel that what happened today was enough justice," he said, adding that Pardo was a disturbed soul. The fallout from Pardo's crimes extended beyond the courtroom. His case became a symbol of how law enforcement training and authority can be weaponized by those who see themselves as above the law. Pardo had learned how to track targets, how to use firearms, and how to exploit vulnerabilities. He had learned these skills as a police officer. He used them to become a serial killer. His time in uniform gave him the confidence and the capability to carry out his murders, and his delusions of righteousness gave him the justification he needed to pull the trigger 9 times. Pardo's legacy is a dark one. In 2015, the shooter video game Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number featured a playable character named Manny Pardo, an unhinged Miami Police Department homicide detective loosely based on the real-life killer. The character goes on killing sprees, using his authority as cover for murder. There has also been speculation that Dexter Morgan, the fictional serial killer and vigilante from the television series Dexter, was inspired in part by Pardo. Both worked in law enforcement in Miami. Both believed they were ridding the world of bad people. Both were fundamentally broken. The families of Pardo's victims waited decades for justice. Sarah Musa's sister attended the execution and said, "It's about time. It's been so long, you just want to get it over with. I still have nightmares, and I don't have words to describe it." For the families, Pardo's execution brought a measure of closure, but it could never bring back the people he had killed. It could never erase the years of pain and loss. And it could never answer the central question that haunted the case. How did a man with Pardo's history ever become a police officer in the first place? Pardo was fired twice from law enforcement positions, once for falsifying tickets, once for lying in court. Both terminations should have been red flags. Both should have prevented him from ever carrying a badge again. But he slipped through the cracks. He moved from agency to agency. And when he was finally out of law enforcement entirely, he took the skills he had learned and the mindset he had developed and turned them into a killing spree. What made Pardo's case particularly disturbing was his complete lack of remorse. Even on the day of his execution, he couldn't bring himself to apologize. He spent his final hours visiting with family, eating a Cuban-style meal of roasted pork, rice and beans, fried plantains, avocado, tomatoes, pumpkin pie, eggnog, and Cuban coffee. He wrote about sports. He wrote about bullfighting. He wrote about his daughter. But he didn't write about the 9 people he had murdered. He didn't acknowledge their humanity. He didn't recognize his guilt. Pardo believed he was a soldier until the very end. He believed his mission had been righteous. He believed he deserved glory. But the truth was far simpler and far darker. Manuel Pardo was a serial killer who used his law enforcement training to hunt and execute 9 people over 92 days. He kept trophies of his crimes. He documented his murders in a diary, and when he was finally caught, convicted, and sentenced to death, he spent 26 years on death row, still believing he had been in the right. The name Manuel Pardo is now a cautionary tale about what happens when authority, training, and delusion converge. His victims, Mario Amador, Roberto Alfonso, Michael Miló, Luis Robledo, Ulpiano Ledo, Farah Quintero, Sarah Musa, Ramon Alvaro, and Daisy Ricard deserved justice. They deserve to be remembered not as casualties in Pardo's imagined war, but as people whose lives mattered. And they deserved a system that would have stopped Pardo long before he had the chance to kill them. Case 4. David Alan Gore. On a summer afternoon in 1983, a 15-year-old boy riding his bicycle through a quiet Vero Beach neighborhood heard screaming. He looked toward the sound and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A naked teenage girl was running down a driveway, her hands tied behind her back, blood on her body. Behind her, also naked, was a large man chasing her. The boy watched as the man caught up to the girl, dragged her back toward a palm tree, and shot her twice in the head. The boy went home and told his mother, and she called the police. That phone call ended a killing spree that had terrorized Indian River County for more than 2 years. The killer's name was David Alan Gore, and he had been hiding behind an auxiliary sheriff's deputy badge the entire time. David Allen Gore was born in 1951 in Florida. He grew up in Indian River County, a rural citrus-growing area about 150 miles north of Miami. Gore was a large man, weighing close to 275 pounds, and he was a firearms enthusiast who studied gunsmithing in his free time. He also studied women, but in a far more sinister fashion. He lost one job as a gas station attendant after the owner found a peephole Gore had drilled between the men's and women's restrooms. It was an early warning sign of the predatory behavior that would define his life. But the warning was ignored. In the late 1970s or early 1980s, Gore obtained a position as an auxiliary deputy with the Indian River County Sheriff's Office. Auxiliary deputies are typically volunteer or part-time officers who assist full-time law enforcement with traffic control, community events, and other non-critical duties. They carry badges, they wear uniforms, and to the average citizen, they look like police officers. Gore understood the power of that badge. He understood that people trusted law enforcement, and he used that trust to lure victims to their deaths. Gore's cousin, Fred Waterfield, became his partner in the killings. Born in 1952, Waterfield was another product of Indian River County. Together, the two men formed what criminal psychologists later described as a morbid alliance, hunting young women at beaches and along stretches of roadways in and around Indian River County. Their first victims were a mother and daughter. On February 19, 1981, Gore accosted 17-year-old Ying-Hua Ling and brandished his auxiliary police badge. The badge gave him instant authority. The teenage girl believed she had to comply with the man in uniform. Gore forced Ying into his truck and drove her to her own home. Once there, he encountered Ying's mother, 48-year-old Xiang Huangling. Gore kidnapped both women at gunpoint. He drove them to a remote location where he and Waterfield were waiting. What happened next was described in court testimony and confessions. Gore later claimed that the mother, Xiang, was tied to a tree and slowly choked to death, while he and Waterfield raped her daughter, Ying. After the assaults, both women were murdered. Gore and Waterfield dismembered the bodies and stuffed the body parts into oil drums, which they buried in an orange grove where Gore worked. The killings were methodical. The disposal was calculated, and the two men walked away, believing they had gotten away with it. 5 months later, on July 15, 1981, the pair targeted 35-year-old Judith Daly, a former Fort Pierce resident who was visiting from California. Gore disabled Daly's car at the beach, then offered her a ride to the nearest telephone. It was a classic predator tactic: create a problem, then offer a solution. Daly accepted the ride. Gore drove her to a secluded area where Waterfield was waiting. Both men raped Judith Daly. Then they murdered her. Her body was left in a remote location. Investigators would later find it and connect her death to Gore. 1 week after Daly's murder, Gore unsuccessfully attempted to abduct a teenage girl using his auxiliary badge. The girl's father filed a complaint with the sheriff's office, and Gore was stripped of his badge. He was no longer an auxiliary deputy. He no longer had the authority of law enforcement. But that didn't stop him. Days later, police spotted Gore hiding in the back seat of a woman's car. He was shirtless and had a cocktail in one hand and a gun in the other. He also had handcuffs, rope, and a police scanner. Gore was arrested and convicted of armed trespassing. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But Gore was released on parole in March 1983, having served only about a year and a half. Within 2 months of his release, he was killing again. On May 20, 1983, Gore and Waterfield encountered 14-year-old Orlando hitchhikers Angelica Lavalley and Barbara Ann Beyer. The girls were picked up, raped, killed, and dismembered. Their bodies were disposed of in the same manner as previous victims. These were the only two crimes for which Waterfield was later convicted, earning him 2 consecutive life sentences. On July 26, 1983, Gore and Waterfield picked up 2 more hitchhikers. Lynn Elliott, 17, and Reagan Martin, 14, were students at Vero Beach High School. They were hitchhiking to Wabasso Beach when the 2 men pulled over and offered them a ride. The girls got into the vehicle. They had no reason to believe they were in danger. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Gore and Waterfield drove the girls to Gore's home. Once inside, the nightmare began. The men separated the girls. Waterfield took Reagan Martin to the attic and held her there. Gore took Lynn Elliott to another room. He tied her hands behind her back with rope. He bound her legs. And then he began to sexually assault her. Lynn Elliott was 17 years old. She was terrified, but she was also determined to survive. At some point during the assault, Lynn managed to free her legs from the rope. When Gore was distracted, she ran. She ran naked from the house, her hands still tied behind her back, and fled down the driveway toward the street. She kicked and screamed as loud as she could, hoping someone would hear her. Gore, also naked, chased after her. He caught up to her near a palm tree in the front yard. He dragged her back, and then he shot her twice in the head. Lynn Elliott died in the driveway of David Allen Gore's home. Michael Rock, the 15-year-old boy riding his bicycle, witnessed the murder. He saw the naked girl running. He saw the naked man chasing her. He saw her get shot. He went home and told his mother, and she called the police. Officers arrived and surrounded Gore's home within minutes. They found Lynn Elliott's body in the trunk of a car in the driveway. Her arms and legs had been tightly bound with rope. She had multiple abrasions on her body consistent with falling and being dragged. The gun used to kill her was found inside Gore's home. And in the attic, officers found Reagan Martin still alive. She had been held captive during Lynn's murder. Her escape from the driveway had saved Reagan's life and ended the killing spree. Gore was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. After his arrest, he confessed to killing 3 other girls and 2 women. He led authorities to the remains of 3 victims, Barbara Ann Beyer, Zhang Huangling, and Ying Hualing. Their bodies had been dismembered and buried. The oil drums were recovered from the orange groves. On December 7, 1983, Gore led police to the burial sites. The full scope of his crimes began to emerge. Gore's trial for the murder of Lynn Elliott began on January 6, 1984. The trial was moved from Vero Beach to St. Petersburg, Florida, due to the intense media coverage and community outrage. On March 16, 1984, the jury convicted Gore of first-degree murder. After an 11-1 vote, he received the death sentence. The Supreme Court of Florida affirmed Gore's first-degree murder conviction and death penalty on August 22, 1985. Gore was also sentenced to life in prison for the other 5 murders. Waterfield was convicted on January 21, 1985, of the murders of Barbara Ann Beyer and Angelica LaValle. He received 2 consecutive life sentences with a specified minimum of 50 years before parole eligibility. Gore spent the next 28 years on death row at Florida State Prison. He filed appeals, but they were rejected. He claimed he had been framed. He challenged his conviction on multiple grounds. All his efforts failed. Meanwhile, the families of his victims waited. Carl and Jean Elliott, Lynn's parents, described Gore as an animal, an evil monster, and the seed of the devil. They said one thing comforted them. Lynn's escape had saved her friend Reagan's life and ended the killing spree. But the wait for justice was excruciating. Carl Elliott was 81 years old by the time Gore's execution date approached. "For us, it's been a nightmare because I just turned 81. I was beginning to think that I might die before he went," he said. Jean Elliott nearly did die. About 2 years before the execution, she was in a coma, and doctors told her son to begin making funeral arrangements. She suddenly began recovering, and she said she believed it was because of her wish to see the 58-year-old Gore die first. She needed to outlive him. She needed to see justice served. On April 12, 2012, Florida prepared to execute David Alan Gore. Governor Rick Scott had signed his death warrant after the Scripps Treasure Coast newspapers asked him about the case. Outside the prison, death penalty protesters gathered. Inside, the families of the victims waited. Mike Daly, whose wife Judy K. Daly was killed by Gore in July 1981, said, "I've been waiting for this day for years. I would have saved the state a lot of money if they let me. I'd do it myself and have no qualms about it." Gore met with a spiritual advisor earlier that day. He was visited by his mother and an ex-wife. His last meal consisted of steak, lobster tail, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream. At 6:00 p.m., Gore was brought into the death chamber and strapped to a gurney. He was asked if he had a final statement. Gore said, "Yes, I do." Then he addressed the Elliott family. "I want to say to the Elliott family, I am sorry for the death of your daughter. I am not the man I was back then, 28 years ago. I am a Christian. Christ lives within me. I hope you all can find peace today," Gore said. Making no eye contact with the family, he added that he hoped they could find it in their hearts to forgive me, and concluded, "I don't fear death." The lethal injection process began. A white sheet had been pulled up to his chin and IV lines ran into his arm. Family members of the victim watched as the drugs began flowing. They made no immediate statement as they left after the execution was carried out. Gore was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m., about 10 minutes after being administered the lethal injection. Nearly 30 years after his conviction, David Alan Gore was dead. The fallout from Gore's crimes extended far beyond his execution. His case highlighted the dangers of auxiliary law enforcement programs that place badges and authority in the hands of individuals who have not undergone the same rigorous screening and training as full-time officers. Gore had been able to use his auxiliary deputy status to gain the trust of victims. The badge had been his weapon as much as the guns and ropes he used to kill, and the system that had given him that badge had failed to screen him adequately. Gore's case also raised questions about preventability. He had been stripped of his auxiliary badge after attempting to abduct a teenage girl. He had been caught days later in a woman's car with handcuffs, rope, a gun, and a police scanner, clear evidence of predatory intent. He had been convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he served only about a year and a half before being released on parole. Within 2 months, he was killing again. 4 more people died because the system released him early. The families of Gore's victims carried the weight of his crimes for decades. Lynn Elliott's parents waited nearly 30 years for his execution. Jean Elliott fought her way out of a coma because she believed she had to live long enough to see Gore die. Mike Daly spoke openly about his desire to execute Gore himself. These were people who had been forced to live with unimaginable loss, waiting year after year for a justice system that moved painfully slowly. Gore and Waterfield killed 6 women and girls over the course of more than 2 years. Yinghua Ling was 17. Her mother, Shang Huangling, was 48. Judith Daly was 35. Angelica Lavallée was 14. Barbara Ann Beyer was 14. Lynn Elliott was 17. They were daughters, mothers, friends, students. They had futures. They had dreams. And they were all taken by 2 men who saw them as nothing more than prey. The image of Lynn Elliott running naked from Gore's house, her hands tied behind her back, screaming for help, remains one of the most haunting details of the case. She fought for her life. She freed her legs. She ran. She did everything she could to survive. But Gore chased her down and shot her, twice in the head, in his own driveway. A 15-year-old boy on a bicycle witnessed the murder and did the right thing. He told his mother. She called the police. And that phone call saved Reagan Martin's life. David Alan Gore spent 28 years on death row. He claimed he had found Christ. He claimed he was no longer the man he had been. But no amount of religious conversion could undo the terror he had inflicted. No apology could bring back the lives he had taken, and no expression of remorse could erase the fact that he had used his badge, his authority, and his position of trust to hunt and kill 6 women and girls. The name David Alan Gore is now a reminder of what happens when predators are given badges. It's a reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored. And it's a reminder that the worst monsters are often the ones who hide in plain sight, wearing uniforms and carrying the symbols of authority that are supposed to protect us. Case 5. Nicholas Tartaglione. Nicholas Tartaglione had once sworn an oath to protect and serve. He had worn the uniform of multiple police departments across the New York area. But by April 2016, the 49-year-old former officer had become something else entirely. He had become a predator driven by greed, willing to torture and kill for money he believed was owed to him. On April 11, 2016, Tartaglione lured 4 men to his property in Otisville, New York. He was looking for $250,000 in missing cocaine money. What followed was more than an hour of torture as he beat one man trying to extract information. When the victim wouldn't talk, Tartaglione strangled him to death with a zip tie. Then he executed the other 3 men simply because they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He buried all 4 bodies in a shallow grave on his property, and he believed he would get away with it. Nicholas Tartaglione's law enforcement career had taken him through multiple departments in the New York area. He had worked as a police officer in Briarcliff Manor, Mount Vernon Pauling, and Chester. On paper, he was an experienced officer with years of service. But there were shadows in his background. Tartaglione had been involved in incidents that raised questions about his judgment and his conduct. He had a history that would later come to light as investigators dug into his past. But in April 2016, he was no longer a police officer. He was a former cop who had become involved in the cocaine trade. The 4 victims were Martin Luna, 41 years old, Urbano Santiago, 35, who was Martin's nephew by marriage, Miguel Luna, 25, who was Martin's nephew, and Hector Gutierrez, 43, a close family friend of all 3. All 4 men left behind loving families. Many of their family members would later attend Tartaglione's trial, sitting through the painful recounting of how their loved ones had died. Martin Luna was the primary target. Tartaglione believed Martin had stolen approximately $250,000 that was meant for the purchase of cocaine. The money was missing, and Tartaglione wanted it back. On April 11, 2016, Tartaglione orchestrated the kidnapping of all 4 men. He lured them to his property in Otisville, a rural area in Orange County, New York. The property was secluded, surrounded by woods, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry far. Once the men arrived, Tartaglione's plan became clear. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an interrogation backed by violence. Tartaglione restrained Martin Luna and began beating him. The torture lasted for more than an hour. Tartaglione struck him repeatedly, demanding to know where the $250,000 was hidden. Martin Luna was bound and helpless. He couldn't fight back. He couldn't escape. And he couldn't give Tartaglione the answer he was looking for, whether because he didn't know or because he refused to say. The beating was relentless. The other 3 men, Urbano Santiago, Miguel Luna, and Hector Gutierrez, were forced to wait, knowing what was happening to Martin and likely understanding what was coming for them. When Martin Luna didn't provide the location of the missing money, Tartaglione made a decision. He took a zip tie, the kind of plastic restraint that police officers carry, and wrapped it around Martin's neck. Then he pulled it tight. Martin Luna was strangled to death with a device designed for law enforcement use. The torture was over, but the killing spree had just begun. Urbano Santiago, Miguel Luna, and Hector Gutierrez had not stolen any money. They had not wronged Tartaglione. They were simply present when Martin Luna was kidnapped and murdered. But Tartaglione couldn't let them go. They were witnesses. They had seen what he had done, and so he executed them. One by one, Tartaglione killed the three men. The method was ruthless. The motive was elimination. They died not because of anything they had done, but simply because they had been there. After the murders, Tartaglione buried all four bodies in a shallow grave on his property. He tried to cover up the crime, hiding the evidence beneath the dirt. But the families of the missing men began asking questions. Martin Luna, Urbano Santiago, Miguel Luna, and Hector Gutierrez had disappeared. Their loved ones reported them missing, and investigators began to piece together what had happened. The FBI, the New York State Police, and the Village of Chester Police Department launched an investigation. They traced the victims' last known movements. They identified Tartaglione as a person of interest. And they searched his property in Otisville. On the property, investigators found the shallow grave. They recovered the bodies of all four victims. The evidence was overwhelming. Tartaglione was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of kidnapping resulting in death, 1 count of kidnapping conspiracy, and 1 count of narcotics conspiracy. The case was prosecuted in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The trial revealed the full horror of what Tartaglione had done. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had tortured Martin Luna for over an hour, beating him while he was restrained and helpless. They showed that Luna had been strangled to death when he didn't provide the information Tartaglione wanted. And they demonstrated that Urbano Santiago, Miguel Luna, and Hector Gutierrez had been executed simply because they had witnessed Martin's torture and murder. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams described the crimes in stark terms. Nicholas Tartaglione brutally and senselessly murdered Martin Luna over money and then ruthlessly executed Urbano Santiago, Miguel Luna, and Hector Gutierrez simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. He tried to cover up his crimes by burying all 4 victims in a shallow grave on his property. Williams praised the outstanding investigative work of the FBI, the New York State Police, and the Village of Chester Police Department. He also thanked the City of Middletown Police Department and the Houston, Texas Police Department for their assistance in the case. At trial, prosecutors sought the federal death penalty for Tartaglione. The case involved multiple aggravating factors: 4 murders, torture, kidnapping, and the ruthless execution of witnesses. But the jury did not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. Under federal law, a unanimous jury verdict is required to impose a death sentence. Without it, Tartaglione faced life in prison instead. In 2023, Tartaglione was convicted on all 11 counts. He was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of kidnapping resulting in death, 1 count of kidnapping conspiracy, and 1 count of narcotics conspiracy. The evidence against him was insurmountable. The bodies had been found on his property. The forensic evidence tied him to the crimes, and the testimony of witnesses and investigators painted a picture of a man who had used his law enforcement training and experience to commit a series of brutal murders. On June 10, 2024, U.S. District Judge Kenneth M. Karras sentenced Tartaglione to 4 consecutive life sentences. The judge made clear that Tartaglione would never leave prison. At sentencing, Judge Karras described Tartaglione as a monster who has shown no remorse for his conduct. The judge's words were echoed by the prosecutors and the families of the victims. This was not a man who had made a mistake. This was a man who had planned and executed a quadruple murder with cold calculation. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams issued a statement after the sentencing. Today's sentence of 4 consecutive life terms justly reflects the pain and suffering each victim underwent at Tartaglione's hands. I hope that this outcome brings some measure of closure to the victims' families and to their community. The families of Martin Luna, Urbano Santiago, Miguel Luna, and Hector Gutierrez had waited years for justice. Many of them attended the trial and the sentencing, enduring the painful details of how their loved ones had been tortured and killed. For them, the life sentences were a measure of accountability, but they could never bring back the men they had lost. Tartaglione is currently incarcerated in a federal prison, serving his 4 consecutive life sentences. He will never be eligible for parole. He will die behind bars. But his story took a strange and macabre turn before his conviction. While awaiting trial, Tartaglione was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. For a brief period, he was the cellmate of Jeffrey Epstein, the financier and convicted sex offender who died in his cell in August 2019 under circumstances that sparked widespread speculation and conspiracy theories. Tartaglione was questioned about Epstein's death, but he was not implicated in it. The connection between the two men was purely circumstantial. 2 high-profile defendants held in the same facility, sharing a cell for a time before Epstein's death. The case against Nicholas Tartaglione raised troubling questions about how former law enforcement officers can use their training and experience for criminal purposes. Tartaglione knew how to plan. He knew how to execute. He knew how to cover up evidence. These were skills he had learned as a police officer, and he used them to orchestrate a quadruple murder. The zip tie he used to strangle Martin Luna was a tool of law enforcement, repurposed as a weapon of murder. The property where he buried the bodies was his own, a calculated decision to keep the evidence close and under his control. The torture of Martin Luna was particularly chilling. For more than an hour, Tartaglione beat a restrained man, demanding information. The other 3 men were forced to witness this brutality, knowing they were likely next. The psychological terror they experienced in those final moments is impossible to fully comprehend. They watched a former police officer torture their friend and family member to death. And then they were executed one by one because they had seen too much. The families of the victims spoke about the devastation that Tartaglione's crimes had inflicted. Martin Luna was 41 years old when he died. He left behind family who loved him. Urbano Santiago was 35, a nephew by marriage who had his whole life ahead of him. Miguel Luna was only 25, a young man with dreams and potential. Hector Gutierrez was 43, a close family friend who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. All 4 men were taken from their families in the most brutal way imaginable. The prosecution of Tartaglione was part of an organized crime drug enforcement task force's operation, which identifies, disrupts, and dismantles criminal organizations using a prosecutor-led, intelligence-driven, multi-agency approach. The case demonstrated the importance of coordination between federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Without that cooperation, Tartaglione might never have been caught. The shallow grave might never have been found, and the families might never have known what happened to their loved ones. What made Tartaglione's case stand out was the sheer brutality and the cold calculation behind it. He tortured a man for over an hour. He strangled him with a zip tie when he didn't get the answers he wanted. He executed 3 other men simply to eliminate witnesses, and he buried all 4 bodies on his own property, believing he could hide the evidence forever. It was a plan born of arrogance and greed, carried out with the skills and knowledge of a former police officer. The judge's description of Tartaglione as a monster was not hyperbole. It was an accurate assessment of a man who had committed monstrous acts. Tartaglione had taken an oath to protect and serve. He had been given a badge and a gun and the authority of the law, and he had perverted all of it. He had used his position and his training not to help people, but to prey on them. He had become the very thing he was supposed to fight against. The fallout from Tartaglione's crimes extended beyond the courtroom. The case exposed the dangers of former law enforcement officers who become involved in criminal activity. These individuals have specialized training. They understand police procedures and investigative techniques. They know how to avoid detection, and when they choose to use that knowledge for criminal purposes, they become uniquely dangerous. Tartaglione was not just a killer. He was a killer with the skills and experience of a police officer. Nicholas Tartaglione will spend the rest of his life in federal prison. He will never see freedom again. But the 4 men he murdered will never come home. Martin Luna will never see his family again. Urbano Santiago will never celebrate another birthday. Miguel Luna will never achieve the dreams he had for his future. And Hector Gutierrez will never spend another moment with the people who loved him. They are gone, victims of a former cop's greed and brutality. The name Nicholas Tartaglione is now synonymous with betrayal. He betrayed his oath, he betrayed his badge, and he betrayed the trust that communities place in law enforcement officers. His crimes were a reminder that the worst predators are sometimes the ones who once wore a uniform. And his life sentences were a reminder that even former cops are not above the law. Case 6, Gerald Goines. On January 28, 2019, a narcotics team from the Houston Police Department prepared to execute a no-knock warrant at a home on Harding Street. According to the warrant, a confidential informant had purchased black tar heroin from the residence just the day before. The home was allegedly a drug den run by dangerous dealers. The officers believed they were about to take down a major operation. They burst through the door without warning, guns drawn, ready for a confrontation. Within minutes, 2 people and a dog were dead and 4 officers were wounded. But there was a problem. The confidential informant didn't exist. The heroin purchase never happened. The warrant was based on lies. And the couple who died, Dennis Tuttle, 59, and Rogina Nicholas, 58, were not drug dealers. They were innocent people killed in their own home because a veteran cop named Gerald Goines had fabricated evidence to get a warrant. The raid on Harding Street would expose decades of corruption and destroy what was left of the community's trust in the Houston Police Department. Gerald Goines had been with the Houston Police Department for 34 years. By 2019, the 55-year-old officer was a veteran of the Narcotics Unit, a division tasked with investigating drug crimes and executing search warrants. Goines had worked hundreds of cases over the course of his career. He had obtained countless warrants. He had made numerous arrests. And he had built a reputation as someone who got results. But behind the numbers and the accolades, there was a pattern of lies and fabricated evidence that stretched back years. Goines had been cutting corners, inventing informants, and falsifying reports, and no one had stopped him. In January 2019, Goines applied for a no-knock warrant for the home at 7815 Harding Street in southeast Houston. A no-knock warrant allows police to enter a residence without announcing themselves, a tactic typically reserved for situations where officers believe announcing their presence would lead to the destruction of evidence or pose a danger to their safety. To obtain the warrant, Goines claimed that a confidential informant had gone to the Harding Street home the previous day and purchased black tar heroin from a white male. Goines stated in the affidavit that the informant had observed a 9mm handgun inside the residence. He described the home as a drug house and the occupants as dangerous dealers. Based on Goines' sworn statement, a judge approved the no-knock warrant. On the afternoon of January 28, 2019, the narcotics team assembled for the raid. The officers included Goines and several others from the unit. They approached the Harding Street home with weapons drawn, prepared for resistance. At approximately 5:00 p.m., they breached the door and entered the residence without warning. Inside, Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas were at home. The couple, who had been together for years, were not expecting company. They were certainly not expecting armed men to burst through their door. What happened next was chaos. According to the officers' accounts, the couple's dog, a large animal, charged at the entry team. One officer shot and killed the dog. Dennis Tuttle, hearing the commotion and likely believing his home was being invaded by criminals, grabbed a revolver and fired at the intruders. Tuttle struck one officer in the shoulder. The officers returned fire. Tuttle was shot multiple times and fell. Rogina Nicholas, trying to reach for Tuttle's gun, or perhaps trying to defend herself, was also shot. Both Tuttle and Nicholas died in their home. 4 officers were wounded during the exchange of gunfire. The scene was a bloodbath. 2 civilians and a dog were dead. Officers had been injured. And the narcotics team began searching the home for the drugs they had been told were inside. But they didn't find black tar heroin. They didn't find large quantities of drugs. They didn't find evidence of a drug-dealing operation. What they found were small amounts of marijuana and cocaine, personal use amounts, not dealer quantities. The home was not a drug den. Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas were not drug kingpins. They were a middle-aged couple who had been killed in a raid based on a lie. The community's reaction was immediate and intense. Family members of Tuttle and Nicholas insisted that the couple were not involved in drug dealing. They described Tuttle as a Navy veteran and Nicholas as a loving partner. Neighbors expressed disbelief that the home had been a drug operation, and questions began to emerge about the warrant and the raid. Who was the confidential informant? Where was the heroin? And why had the officers used such aggressive tactics? The Houston Police Department initially defended the raid. Police Chief Art Acevedo held a press conference and described the operation as a response to neighborhood complaints about drug activity. He said the officers had acted appropriately. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to uncover problems. The confidential informant mentioned in Goines' affidavit could not be located. When questioned, the informant that Goines usually worked with denied ever going to the Harding Street home or purchasing heroin. The entire basis for the warrant was falling apart. In the weeks following the raid, the truth began to emerge. Gerald Goines had lied in his affidavit for the search warrant. There was no controlled buy. The confidential informant had not purchased heroin from the residence. Goines had fabricated the entire story to obtain the no-knock warrant. He had falsified evidence, committed perjury, and sent a narcotics team into a home under false pretenses. And 2 people were dead because of it. Goines was relieved of duty and placed under criminal investigation. The Houston Police Department launched an internal review of his cases. Prosecutors began examining thousands of arrests and convictions that Goines had been involved in over his 34-year career. What they found was a pattern of corruption that spanned decades. Goines had a history of lying in affidavits, fabricating informants, and planting evidence. Case after case began to unravel. A dozen officers tied to the narcotics squad that conducted the raid, including Goines, were later indicted on various charges following a corruption probe. Some of the charges were eventually dismissed by a judge in June, but the scope of the corruption was undeniable. Since the raid, prosecutors reviewed thousands of cases handled by the narcotics unit. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned at least 22 convictions linked to Goines. More cases are still under review. The damage to the criminal justice system was staggering. In September 2024, Gerald Goines stood trial for the murders of Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas. The prosecution argued that Goins' lies in the warrant affidavit had directly caused their deaths. Under Texas law, felony murder holds a person criminally liable if someone dies during the commission of a felony. Goins had committed perjury to obtain the warrant. The raid that followed resulted in 2 deaths. Therefore, Goins was guilty of murder. The jury found Gerald Goins guilty of 2 counts of felony murder. He was convicted on September 26, 2024, after deliberating for less than a full day. Goins looked down and did not visibly react as the verdict was read. He had been free on bond since he was charged in 2019, but he was immediately taken into custody after the conviction. The punishment phase of the trial began the next day. Family members of Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas gave victim impact statements. Ryan Tuttle, Dennis's son, sat on the witness stand with a framed photograph of his father and stepmother. He said they were victims of severe systematic failure in police work, particularly with the supervision of Gerald Goins. The families asked for the maximum sentence. Goins' defense attorney, Nicole DeBoard, asked for the minimum sentence of 5 years. She argued that Goins had dedicated his life to keeping drugs off the streets. Our community is safer with someone like Gerald, with the heart to serve and the heart to care, she said. Prosecutors, on the other hand, asked for life in prison. They told jurors that Goins preyed upon people he was supposed to protect with a years-long pattern of corruption that had severely damaged the relationship between law enforcement and the community. After deliberating for more than 10 hours, the jury sentenced Gerald Goins to 60 years in prison. The sentences for each count of murder will run concurrently, meaning he will serve them at the same time rather than consecutively. Goins is 60 years old. He will be approximately 114 years old at his earliest possible release date, assuming he serves the full sentence with credit for good behavior. In practical terms, Gerald Goins will die in prison. As the sentence was read, Goins looked down but had no visible reaction. He heard the verdicts for each count of murder without expression. For the families of Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas, the 60-year sentence was a measure of justice, though far less than the life sentence they had hoped for. Ryan Tuttle expressed disappointment that the sentence was not harsher, but he acknowledged that at least Goins would be held accountable. In a statement after the sentencing, the families of Tuttle and Nicholas expressed gratitude. Nicholas's family said in a statement that the jury saw this case for what it was: vicious murders by corrupt police, an epic cover-up attempt, and a measure of justice, at least with Goins. The families also filed federal civil rights lawsuits against Goins, 12 other officers involved in the raid, and the city of Houston. Those lawsuits are set to be tried in November and may result in significant financial settlements. But the fallout from the Harding Street raid extends far beyond Gerald Goins' conviction. The case exposed systemic problems within the Houston Police Department's narcotics unit. The review of thousands of cases revealed a culture of corner-cutting and fabrication. Officers routinely lied in warrant affidavits. Supervisors failed to oversee their work. And the department's leadership allowed the corruption to fester for decades. Chief Art Acevedo, who initially defended the raid, later acknowledged the depth of the problems and promised reforms. But the damage had been done. Goins also faces federal criminal charges in connection with the raid. Those charges are still pending and could result in additional prison time. The federal case will focus on civil rights violations and may carry its own penalties independent of the state murder convictions. For Goins, the legal battles are far from over, though his fate is already sealed. The story of Gerald Goins is not just about one corrupt cop. It's about a system that enabled and protected him for 34 years. It's about supervisors who ignored warning signs and red flags. It's about a narcotics unit that prioritized arrests and convictions over truth and justice. and it's about a community that lost faith in the police department tasked with protecting it. Dennis Tuttle was 59 years old when he was killed. He was a Navy veteran who had served his country. Regina Nicholas was 58 years old. She had been his partner for years. They were not perfect people. They had their struggles, but they were not drug dealers. They were not dangerous criminals. They were a couple living in their home when armed men burst through the door and killed them. They died because Gerald Goins lied on a piece of paper to get a warrant. The raid on Harding Street forced uncomfortable questions into public conversation. How many other warrants were based on lies? How many other innocent people had been targeted? How many convictions were tainted by fabricated evidence? And how many officers in the narcotics unit knew what Goins was doing but said nothing? The answers to those questions are still being uncovered, but the scale of the corruption is already staggering. At least 22 convictions have been overturned. Dozens of people who were sent to prison based on cases involving Goins are now questioning whether they received fair trials. Some have been released. Others are still fighting to clear their names. The ripple effects of one officer's lies have touched hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives. And the Houston Police Department is still grappling with how to restore trust in a community that feels betrayed. Goins' defense attorneys argued that the case was not legally a murder case. They acknowledged that Goins had lied to obtain the warrant, but they minimized the impact of his false statements. They portrayed Dennis Tuttle as an armed man who fired at police officers, making him responsible for his own death. They argued that Goins' lies did not merit a murder conviction. The jury disagreed. They saw the case for what it was: two people dead because a cop lied. The judge's comments at sentencing reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Although the exact remarks are not publicly available, the 60-year sentence speaks for itself. This was not a slap on the wrist. This was not probation or a suspended sentence. This was a recognition that Gerald Goins' actions had led directly to the deaths of two people and had corrupted the criminal justice system for decades. Gerald Goins is now inmate number 025143996 in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a former cop surrounded by the very people he once arrested. For a man who spent 34 years enforcing the law, the irony is inescapable. He will die in a prison cell, just like the people he helped put there, except many of them may have been innocent. The name Gerald Goins is now a symbol of corruption and institutional failure. He represents what happens when one officer is allowed to operate without oversight for decades. He represents the dangers of a system that values arrests over accuracy. And he represents the catastrophic consequences when the people sworn to protect us become the ones we need protection from. Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas are gone. Their families are left with grief and anger, and the city of Houston is left with a police department that must rebuild trust one case at a time. The Harding Street raid will be remembered as a turning point, a moment when the lies could no longer be ignored and the corruption could no longer be swept under the rug. But for the families of the victims, no amount of accountability can bring back the people they lost. Case 7. Derek Chauvin. On May 25, 2020, a 17-year-old girl named Darnella Frazier was walking to a convenience store with her young cousin when she saw something that made her stop. A Minneapolis police officer was kneeling on a man's neck. The man was handcuffed, lying face down on the pavement, and he was saying he couldn't breathe. Bystanders were gathering, their voices rising in alarm, begging the officer to get off, but the officer didn't move. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, he kept his knee pressed against the man's neck while the man pleaded for his life, called out for his mother, and eventually fell silent. Darnella Frazier pulled out her phone and recorded what she was seeing. That video would change the world. The man's name was George Floyd. The officer's name was Derek Chauvin, and the killing captured on that cell phone would spark the largest civil rights protests in American history. Derek Michael Chauvin was born in 1976 and joined the Minneapolis Police Department in 2001. By May 2020, he had been with the department for 19 years. He was a field training officer, responsible for teaching new recruits how to do the job. On paper, he was an experienced officer with nearly 2 decades of service. But Chauvin had a reputation. He was known for aggressive tactics. He had 18 prior complaints filed against him over the course of his career. Most were closed without discipline. 2 resulted in reprimands, letters placed in his file that carried no real consequences. The warning signs were there. The pattern of complaints was documented. But Derek Chauvin remained on the force, and on May 25, 2020, he was working the streets of Minneapolis. That afternoon, a clerk at Cup Foods, a convenience store at the corner of Chicago Avenue South and East 38th Street, called 911. A customer had allegedly used a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase cigarettes. The customer, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd, was sitting in a vehicle parked outside the store. Officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Kyung arrived first. They approached Floyd's vehicle and attempted to place him under arrest. Floyd was cooperative at first, but he became distressed as the officers tried to force him into the back of a squad car. He said he was claustrophobic. He said he couldn't breathe. He struggled, not violently, but with the panic of someone afraid of confined spaces. Derek Chauvin and Officer Tu Tao arrived as backup. Chauvin, the senior officer, took control of the situation. Floyd was pulled from the squad car and forced to the ground. He was handcuffed behind his back, lying face down on the pavement. And then Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck. Chauvin placed his left knee on the right side of Floyd's neck and his right knee on Floyd's back. Floyd was pinned beneath Chauvin's weight, unable to move, unable to escape, and he was unable to breathe. George Floyd began to plead. "I can't breathe," he said. He said it more than 20 times. He told the officers he was in pain. He called out for his mother, who had died 2 years earlier. "Mama," he said, "Mama, I'm through." Bystanders gathered on the sidewalk, watching in horror. They pulled out their phones and began recording. They shouted at the officers to check Floyd's pulse, to get off his neck, to let him breathe. A teenage girl begged them to stop. An off-duty Minneapolis firefighter identified herself and asked to check Floyd's condition. She was told to stay back. Darnella Frazier, standing on the sidewalk with her cousin, held her phone steady and recorded. She captured Chauvin's face, impassive and expressionless, as Floyd's voice grew weaker. She captured the moment Floyd stopped moving. She captured the moment his eyes closed. And she captured the moment the life went out of him. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck. For more than 4 of those minutes, Floyd was unresponsive. He had lost consciousness. He had no pulse. And still, Chauvin did not move. Paramedics arrived and checked for signs of life. George Floyd was loaded into an ambulance and taken to Hennepin County Medical Center. He was pronounced dead a short time later. An autopsy would later determine that Floyd died from cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. In simpler terms, George Floyd's heart stopped because Derek Chauvin cut off the blood flow to his brain and restricted his ability to breathe. It was a homicide. Within hours, the video recorded by Darnella Frazier was circulating online. It was shared on social media. It was broadcast on news channels, and it was watched by millions of people around the world. The footage was undeniable. There was no ambiguity, no question of perspective or interpretation. The video showed exactly what had happened. An officer had knelt on a man's neck for more than 9 minutes while the man begged for his life, and bystanders pleaded for mercy. And then the man died. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted in Minneapolis that night. By the next day, demonstrations had spread across the United States. Within a week, protests were happening in cities around the world: London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Sydney. Millions of people took to the streets, holding signs that read, "Black Lives Matter" and "I Can't Breathe." George Floyd's death became a rallying cry for a movement demanding an end to police brutality and systemic racism. The protests were the largest civil rights demonstrations in American history. On May 29, 2020, 4 days after George Floyd's death, Derek Chauvin was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The charges were later upgraded to include second-degree unintentional murder. Chauvin was the first white police officer in Minnesota to be charged with murdering a black civilian. The other 3 officers at the scene, Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kueng, and To Tao, were charged with aiding and abetting murder and manslaughter for failing to intervene. Chauvin's trial began on March 8, 2021. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The video recorded by Darnella Frazier was played for the jury. Additional footage from police body cameras and surveillance cameras was introduced. Medical experts testified that Floyd had died from asphyxiation caused by Chauvin's knee on his neck. Use of force experts, including Chauvin's own police chief, testified that the restraint Chauvin used was not consistent with department training and was unreasonable under the circumstances. The defense argued that Floyd's death was caused by underlying health conditions and drug use, not by Chauvin's actions. They pointed to Floyd's heart disease and the presence of fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. But the medical evidence was clear. Floyd's heart stopped because he couldn't breathe. And he couldn't breathe because Derek Chauvin was kneeling on his neck. On April 20th, 2021, after about 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. It was a swift and decisive rebuke. Chauvin's bail was revoked, and he was immediately taken into custody. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted in celebration. People cried, hugged, and chanted Floyd's name. Inside the courtroom, Floyd's family wept with relief. For many, the conviction was a rare moment of accountability in a system that too often fails to hold police officers responsible for their actions. On June 25, 2021, Derek Chauvin returned to court for sentencing. Members of George Floyd's family gave victim impact statements. Philonise Floyd, George's brother, spoke about the nightmares he's had since his brother's death, about how he can no longer sleep through the night. "I have begged every day for justice to be served," he said. "My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back." 7-year-old Gianna Floyd, George's daughter, appeared by video and said she misses her father and asks about him all the time. Chauvin's mother also spoke. She called her son a good man and said his identity had been reduced to that of a racist. She said she supported him 100%. Chauvin himself spoke briefly, offering condolences to the Floyd family and saying there would be some other information in the future that might give them peace of mind. He did not apologize. He did not take responsibility. Judge Peter Cahill sentenced Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison. The sentence was longer than the 12.5-year presumptive guideline for someone with no prior criminal record, but shorter than the 30 years prosecutors had requested. Judge Cahill explained that he had found 4 aggravating factors. Chauvin had abused a position of trust and authority. He had treated Floyd with particular cruelty. He had committed the crime with a group of other officers, and children were present during the offense. Mr. Chauvin, rather than pursuing the MPD mission, treated Mr. Floyd without respect and denied him the dignity owed to all human beings, the judge said. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, whose office prosecuted the case, called the sentencing a moment of real accountability on the road to justice. He acknowledged that it was not full justice, nothing could bring George Floyd back, but it was a step forward. The Floyd family expressed mixed feelings. They were grateful for the conviction, but many felt the sentence was too lenient for a man who had murdered someone in broad daylight while the world watched. Chauvin's legal troubles were far from over. In December 2021, he pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges for violating George Floyd's constitutional rights. He also pleaded guilty to violating the rights of a 14-year-old boy in a separate 2017 incident. In that case, Chauvin had used excessive force during an arrest, holding his knee on the teenager's back for more than 15 minutes while the boy was handcuffed and prone. The pattern of behavior was clear. On July 7, 2022, Chauvin was sentenced to 21 years in federal prison, to be served concurrently with his state sentence. He was transferred to federal custody to serve his time. Derek Chauvin is currently incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Tucson, Arizona. On November 24, 2023, he was stabbed by another inmate, John Turskak, a former gang member and FBI informant. Chauvin was seriously injured but survived. The attack took place on Black Friday, and Turskak later said he chose that date because of its symbolic connection to the Black Lives Matter movement. Chauvin has since recovered from his injuries and remains in federal custody. Chauvin has appealed his conviction multiple times, arguing that he did not receive a fair trial due to pretrial publicity and the potential for civil unrest if he had been acquitted. He has claimed that the jury was influenced by external pressures and that the massive protests and media coverage made it impossible for him to get an impartial hearing. The Minnesota Court of Appeals rejected his appeal in April 2023. The Minnesota Supreme Court declined to review the case in July 2023. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal in November 2023. His conviction stands. In November 2023, Chauvin filed a motion in federal court attempting to vacate his civil rights conviction. He claimed that new evidence, specifically a theory that a tumor may have contributed to Floyd's death, would have changed the outcome of his case. In December 2024, a federal judge accepted Chauvin's request to have Floyd's tissue samples retested to check for alternative causes of death. The motion is still pending, but legal experts consider it a long shot. The evidence against Chauvin is overwhelming, and the video speaks for itself. The impact of George Floyd's death extends far beyond Derek Chauvin's conviction. The protests that followed his murder became a global movement. In the United States, demonstrations took place in more than 2,000 cities and towns. Millions of people participated. It was the largest protest movement in American history. The protests led to renewed calls for police reform, including demands to defund or abolish police departments, to end qualified immunity for officers, and to hold police accountable for misconduct. Some reforms were enacted. Minneapolis banned chokeholds and neck restraints. The Minneapolis City Council voted to dismantle the police department and replace it with a community-led public safety model, though that effort was later scaled back. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act was introduced in Congress, proposing nationwide reforms, including a ban on chokeholds and no-knock warrants, limits on qualified immunity, and the creation of a national police misconduct registry. The bill passed the House of Representatives but stalled in the Senate. As of late 2024, comprehensive federal police reform has not been achieved. The Floyd family filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Minneapolis. In March 2021, the city agreed to a $27 million settlement, one of the largest pre-trial settlements in a civil rights wrongful death case. The settlement was announced during jury selection for Chauvin's criminal trial, leading his defense attorneys to argue that it prejudiced the jury. The judge denied the motion, but the timing raised questions about whether the settlement influenced the trial's outcome. Darnella Frazier, the teenager who recorded the video, was awarded a special citation from the Pulitzer Prize Board in 2021 for her courage in documenting Floyd's murder. The Pulitzer Board said Frazier's video spurred protests against police brutality around the world, highlighting the crucial role of citizens in journalists' quests for truth and justice. Frazier has spoken about the trauma of witnessing Floyd's death and the weight of knowing her video changed history. She has said she sometimes wishes she could have done more to save him, though many have told her that her act of recording was itself an act of bravery that brought accountability. George Floyd's death also reignited conversations about systemic racism in America. It forced people to confront the reality that Black Americans are disproportionately killed by police. An NPR investigation found that police officers in the U.S. shot and killed at least 135 unarmed Black men and women between 2015 and 2021, and that at least 75% of the officers involved were white. Law enforcement officers in the U.S. killed 1,099 people in 2019, more than any other wealthy democracy. Floyd's death became a symbol of that systemic violence, and his name became synonymous with the fight for justice. What made Derek Chauvin's case unique was the existence of video evidence that left no room for doubt. Historically, police officers are rarely convicted of murder. Between 2005 and 2021, only 11 non-federal law enforcement officers were convicted of murder resulting from an on-duty incident. Chauvin became part of that small group. The video recorded by Darnella Frazier and the body camera footage from the officers involved provided incontrovertible proof of what had happened. Without that video, many believe Chauvin would never have been charged, let alone convicted. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz publicly thanked Frazier, saying the video was maybe the only reason that Derek Chauvin will go to prison. The image of Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck, his hands casually in his pockets, his face expressionless, became one of the defining images of the 21st century. That image captured what many saw as the callous indifference of police officers who abuse their power. Chauvin's flat eye effect, his lack of emotion, his refusal to respond to Floyd's pleas or the bystanders' cries, became a symbol of a broken system. For more than 9 minutes, he slowly killed a man in broad daylight, and he did it with the confidence of someone who believed he would face no consequences. George Floyd was 46 years old when he died. He was a father, a brother, a son, and a friend. He had struggled with addiction and had a criminal record, but he was trying to turn his life around. He had moved to Minneapolis for a fresh start. He worked as a security guard and a truck driver. He was known for his kindness and his smile. His friends called him Big Floyd. His daughter called him Daddy. And on May 25, 2020, he went to a convenience store to buy cigarettes with what may have been a counterfeit $20 bill. That decision cost him his life. The 3 other officers involved in Floyd's death were also held accountable. Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kueng, and To Thao were convicted on federal charges of violating Floyd's civil rights. Lane and Kueng were sentenced to 2.5 and 3 years in prison, respectively. Thao was sentenced to 3.5 years. In state court, Thao was convicted of aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to nearly 5 years. Lane and Kueng pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting manslaughter and received sentences of 3 and 3.5 years. All 3 are serving their sentences. Derek Chauvin will spend at least the next 2 decades in prison. By the time he is eligible for release, he will be in his mid-60s. He will have spent more than half of his remaining life behind bars. But for the Floyd family, no amount of prison time can bring George back. Philinaz. Floyd said it best. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back. The name Derek Chauvin is now inseparable from the murder of George Floyd. It is a name that represents the worst of policing, the abuse of power, the lack of accountability, the indifference to black lives. But it is also a name that represents a turning point. Chauvin's conviction was historic. It proved that even police officers can be held accountable for murder. It showed that video evidence and public outcry can force a system to deliver justice. And it demonstrated that change, however slow and incomplete, is possible. George Floyd's death was a tragedy, but it also became a catalyst for a movement that continues to demand justice, equity, and an end to police violence. His name is now spoken at protests around the world. His face is painted on murals in cities from Minneapolis to Manila. And his final words, "I can't breathe," have become a rallying cry for a generation, fighting for change. Derek Chauvin took George Floyd's life, but he could not silence the movement that Floyd's death inspired. Case 8. Gerard Schaefer. On July 22, 1972, a sheriff's deputy on patrol in Martin County, Florida, was flagged down by two hysterical young women. Their hands were in handcuffs. They were crying, terrified, barely able to speak. When they finally got the words out, they told a story that seemed impossible. A police officer had picked them up while they were hitchhiking. He'd driven them to a remote wooded area. He'd tied them to trees with nooses around their necks. And then his police radio had called him away. The girls had managed to free themselves and run. They'd escaped with their lives. The officer's name was Gerard John Schaefer, Jr. He was 26 years old, a deputy with the Martin County Sheriff's Office. And the two girls he'd tried to kill were not his first victims. They were just the ones who got away. Gerard John Schaefer, Jr. was born on March 26, 1946, in Wisconsin, and was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. He was the eldest of 3 children in a household he later described as troubled. Schaefer claimed he didn't get along with his father, a drinker and a womanizer, and he believed his parents favored his sister over him. He later described himself as the illegitimate product of a forced marriage. Whether these claims were true or simply part of Schaefer's lifelong pattern of manipulation and self-pity is unclear. What is clear is that, by his own admission, Schaefer exhibited disturbing behavior from a young age. He claimed that when he was 11 years old, he nearly smothered a 9-year-old girl to death. This claim was never substantiated, but it fit a pattern that would define his life. The Schaefer family moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where Gerard joined the local yachting and country clubs and presented himself as a respectable young man. He was a Boy Scout. He earned an associate degree in business administration in 1967. In 1968, he enrolled at Florida Atlantic University to get a teacher's license. After completing his studies, he briefly held down a teaching job at Plantation High School, but he was fired after only a few weeks. The principal later said Schaefer exhibited totally inappropriate behavior. What exactly that behavior entailed was never fully detailed, but it was serious enough to end his teaching career almost before it began. Schaefer then tried to become a Catholic priest, but he was rejected by the seminary. He married in 1968, but divorced after 2 years, with his wife citing cruelty as the reason. In 1971, he married again, this time to Teresa Dean, a secretary he met while working as a security guard. Schaefer seemed unable to hold down any job or relationship for long. He drifted through life, searching for a role that would give him authority and access to victims. Eventually, Schaefer set his mind on becoming a police officer. He applied to the Wilton Manors Police Department and was hired despite failing his psychological evaluation. The warning signs were there. The test results indicated that Schaefer was not psychologically suited for law enforcement, but in the early 1970s, many small police departments were understaffed and desperate for officers. Schaefer was given a badge and a gun. For a time, he even earned a commendation for his role in a drug bust. But his time in Wilton Manors was short-lived. Schaefer was caught using personal information about female traffic offenders to ask them out on dates. He was fired. Undeterred, Schaefer applied to the Martin County Sheriff's Office and was hired as a deputy. Sheriff Robert Crowder later said that Schaefer seemed well-spoken, trustworthy, and apple-cheeked. He had no idea what he was bringing into his department. Schaefer had found the perfect cover. As a law enforcement officer, he had authority, access, and the trust of the public. He had a badge that opened doors, and he had a gun and handcuffs that he could use to control his victims. On July 21, 1972, Schaefer picked up two teenage hitchhikers, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells. He showed them his badge and told them he was a police officer. The girls trusted him. Schaefer drove them to a remote wooded area, far from any roads or witnesses. Once there, he pulled out handcuffs and ropes. He tied the girls to trees, placing nooses around their necks so that if they struggled or lost their footing, they would hang themselves. It was a method of torture designed to maximize suffering and terror. The girls were bound, helpless, and facing death. But then Schaefer's police radio crackled to life. A call came in. Schaefer was needed back at the station. He looked at the two girls tied to the trees and said, "I'll be back in a little while." Then he got into his unmarked car and drove away, leaving them to die. But Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells didn't give up. They worked frantically to free themselves. They managed to loosen the ropes. They got the nooses off their necks, and they ran. They made it to a highway and flagged down a car. The driver took them to safety, and they reported what had happened to the police, giving a thorough description of the man who had tried to kill them. They even gave his name, Deputy Gerard Schaefer. When confronted, Schaefer tried to backpedal. He spun a tale about trying to scare the girls to teach them a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking. He claimed he was trying to help them, to show them how dangerous it was to get into cars with strangers. Sheriff Crowder didn't buy the story. He fired Schaefer and filed charges against him, 1 count of false imprisonment and 2 counts of aggravated assault. At his arraignment, Schaefer was offered a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to 1 count of aggravated assault, he would receive a sentence of only 1 year in jail and 3 years probation. Schaefer accepted the deal and requested that his bond be extended for another 6 months so he could help his wife relocate to Fort Lauderdale. His request was granted. During those 6 months of freedom, Schaefer killed again. In September 1972, 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup disappeared while hitchhiking in Fort Lauderdale. The 2 girls were last seen getting into a vehicle. Their families reported them missing, but there were no leads. No bodies were found. The case went cold. Schaefer, meanwhile, began serving his 1-year sentence for the assault on Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells. While Schaefer was in jail, more disappearances occurred. In October 1972, Lee Hainline and Barbara Ann Briscolina vanished. In January 1973, Colette Marie Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox disappeared while hitchhiking from Iowa to Florida. The pattern was unmistakable. Young women and teenage girls were vanishing across South Florida. But no one had connected the cases. No one suspected that a former deputy sitting in a county jail was responsible. In April 1973, Schaefer was released from jail. He moved back in with his mother. And then, in a stroke of luck for investigators, Susan Place's mother, Lucille, found something in her daughter's bedroom. It was a letter. The letter mentioned a man named Jerry Shepard, who had offered Susan and Georgia a ride. Lucille Place gave the letter to police. Investigators began looking for Jerry Shepard. What they found was that Jerry Shepard and Gerard Schaefer were the same person. Schaefer had been using the alias Jerry Shepard when he met the girls. Armed with this information, police obtained a search warrant for Schaefer's mother's home. What they found was a house of horrors. In the attic, investigators discovered a trunk filled with jewelry, identification cards, teeth, and personal belongings from numerous missing girls. There were items belonging to Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. There were items belonging to Lee Hainline and Barbara Ann Briscolina. There were items from other victims whose names investigators didn't even know yet. Schaefer had been keeping trophies. By the amount of evidence found, police estimated that Schaefer had killed around 30 young women over the previous few years. Detectives also found writings. Schaefer had written detailed accounts of his crimes, describing the abductions, the torture, and the murders in graphic detail. He had documented his fantasies and his actions in what would later be called the final chapter. The writings were chilling. They revealed a man who took pleasure in the suffering of his victims, who saw women as objects to be dominated and destroyed. Prosecutor Robert Stone, who would later lead the case against Schaefer, said he was the most sexually deviant person I had ever seen. He made Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. On December 7, 1973, Schaefer led police to the remains of 3 of his victims, Barbara Ann Briscolina, Shang Huangling, and Yinghua Ling. The bodies were in advanced states of decomposition, buried in remote locations. Schaefer also admitted to killing 3 other girls and 2 women, though he would later recant and claim he had been framed. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. Jewelry belonging to the victims was in his possession. His writings described the murders in detail, and 2 victims, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, had escaped and lived to testify against him. Schaefer was formally charged with the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. He was indicted in May 1973 and held without bond pending trial. In October 1973, Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences. Notably, he was not sentenced to death, though Florida had reinstated the death penalty in 1972. The reasons for this are unclear, but it may have been due to the lack of bodies at the time of his trial for the Place and Jessup murders, or the fact that the state wanted to ensure he could never be released. Schaefer was sent to Florida State Prison, where he would spend the next 22 years. He appealed his conviction multiple times, claiming at one point that he had been framed. All his appeals were rejected. While in prison, Schaefer filed numerous frivolous lawsuits. He sued one true crime writer for calling him overweight. He sued authors Colin Wilson and Michael Newton and former FBI agent Robert Ressler for describing him as a serial killer. All of his lawsuits were thrown out of court. Schaefer also ran mail fraud schemes from his cell. He had associates post ads in sex magazines, and he would send letters to people who replied, always using a female pseudonym. In some correspondence, he pretended to be a 14-year-old girl who offered to send paying customers nude photos of herself. Schaefer also befriended fellow serial killers Ted Bundy and Ottis Toole. He discussed counter-forensic techniques with Bundy. He was not a well-liked man in prison, but he found camaraderie among other predators. He also worked as a jailhouse lawyer, using information he gained from other convicts to sell them out to authorities. He even provided information that helped send another murderer to death row. Despite being in prison, Schaefer continued to write. He collaborated with Sandra London, his girlfriend from high school, who interviewed him at length after his conviction. London published a compilation of Schaefer's short stories and drawings in 1990, titled Killer Fiction. A second book, Beyond Killer Fiction, followed in 1992. The stories within these books typically involved the savage, graphic torture, mutilation, and murder of young women, usually written from the perspective of the killer, who was often a rogue police officer. The books provided a disturbing window into Schaefer's mind and confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Schaefer was one of the most prolific serial killers in Florida history. London later broke off her engagement to Schaefer and became involved with another serial killer, Danny Rolling, also known as the Gainesville Ripper. Schaefer sued London for referring to him as a serial killer in print, but the lawsuit was dismissed after London provided a 500-page exhibit of Schaefer's incriminating correspondence to the judge. In December 1995, police scheduled an interview with Schaefer regarding 3 women whose remains had recently been found. The interview was set for Monday. But on Friday, December 3, 1995, Gerard Schaefer was found dead in his cell. He had been stabbed to death by a fellow inmate, Vincent Rivera, a 32-year-old man serving time for double murder. Schaefer had been stabbed over 40 times in the face, head, neck, and body. His throat had been slashed. His right eye was destroyed. Several ribs were fractured. The murder was so violent and bloody that it might have made a good story in one of Schaefer's own books, had he lived to write it. The official reason given for the murder was a dispute over hot water, though some investigators believed Rivera may have killed Schaefer because he owed inmates money or because he was known to inform on other prisoners. Schaefer's death was met with mixed reactions. His family mourned, but Sandra London said it felt like an overpowering stink had finally blown out of the room, that now she could breathe fresh air. Investigators, no longer fearing lawsuits, spoke openly about Schaefer being one of the worst, sickest criminals they had ever encountered. One law enforcement officer described him as having halitosis of the soul. Judge Cyrus Trowbridge, who had overseen Schaefer's trial, responded to the news of his death by saying, "He's finally gotten the death sentence he ultimately deserved but couldn't be given." Schaefer had avoided the electric chair in court, but he met a brutal end in prison. For the families of his victims, his death brought a measure of closure, though it also meant that answers to many questions would never be known. Schaefer had been linked to as many as 30 murders, but he was only convicted of 2. The full extent of his crimes died with him. The case of Gerard Schaefer is a chilling example of how a serial killer can hide behind a badge. Schaefer used his position as a police officer to gain the trust of his victims. He used his authority to lure young women and teenage girls into his vehicle. And he used the tools of law enforcement, handcuffs, knowledge of remote locations, and an understanding of how to avoid detection to carry out his crimes. His badge was his weapon, and it gave him access to victims who would never have gotten into a car with a stranger. Schaefer's case also highlights the failures of the hiring process. He failed his psychological evaluation when he applied to be a police officer. He was fired from his teaching job for inappropriate behavior. He was rejected by the priesthood, and he was fired from the Wilton Manors Police Department for using personal information to stalk women. Every red flag was there, but he was hired by the Martin County Sheriff's Office. The desperation for officers, the lack of thorough background checks, and the failure to heed warning signs all contributed to putting a predator in a position of power. The bizarre detail that saved Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells' lives was the police radio. Schaefer had tied them to trees and was preparing to kill them when a call came through. He left to respond, fully intending to return and finish what he had started, but the girls escaped. That radio call, that moment of interruption, was the difference between life and death. It was pure chance, and it was the only reason Schaefer was caught when he was. Susan Place was 17 years old. Georgia Jessup was 16. Lee Hainline was 21. Barbara Ann Briscolina was 14. Colette Marie Goodenough was 19. Barbara Ann Wilcox was 19. Xiang Huangling was 48. Yinghua Ling was 17. These are just some of the names of the women and girls linked to Gerard Schaefer. Many more victims remain unidentified. Their jewelry, their teeth, their belongings were found in Schaefer's attic. but their names are unknown. Their families may still be searching for them. And Schaefer took the truth to his grave. The name Gerard Schaefer became synonymous with some of the most heinous crimes in Florida history. He was known as the Killer Cop, the Hangman, and the Butcher of Blind Creek. He was a man who should never have been given a badge. And yet, he was. The system failed. Young women paid the price. And even after his death, the full scope of his crimes remains a mystery. Gerard Schaefer is buried in an unmarked grave. His legacy is one of terror, pain, and unanswered questions. The families of his victims are left to wonder what happened to their loved ones and whether the man who took them ever felt remorse. The answer, based on everything known about Schaefer, is almost certainly no. He was a predator who found joy in suffering, and he wore a badge while he did it. Case 9. Kim Potter. On April 11, 2021, a routine traffic stop in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, ended in tragedy. Officer Kimberly Potter, a 26-year veteran of the police force and a field training officer, pulled over a young black man named Daunte Wright for expired registration tags and an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror. When officers discovered Wright had an outstanding warrant for a misdemeanor weapons charge, they attempted to arrest him. Wright pulled away and tried to get back into his car. Potter reached for what she believed was her taser. She yelled, "Taser! Taser! Taser!" as a warning to her fellow officers. But what she held in her hand was her Glock 9mm handgun. She pulled the trigger. The bullet struck 20-year-old Daunte Wright in the chest. He drove about 470 feet before his car crashed into another vehicle. Wright died at the scene. Potter's immediate reaction was captured on body camera footage. "Oh shit, I just shot him. I grabbed the wrong fucking gun." She collapsed to the curb sobbing. "I'm going to prison. I just killed a boy." For the Wright family and the community, Potter's conviction and sentencing would raise painful questions about accountability, race, and whether some officers are held to a different standard than others. Kimberly Ann Potter was born in 1972 and joined the Brooklyn Center Police Department in 1995, shortly after graduating from St. Mary's University of Minnesota in 1994. She spent 26 years on the force, working her way up to the position of field training officer. In that role, she was responsible for training new officers and modeling proper police procedures. Potter had completed annual recertifications for her weapons, with her most recent taser certification completed on March 2, 2021, just over a month before the shooting. She was considered an experienced, competent officer with no significant disciplinary record. On the afternoon of April 11, 2021, she was training a new officer during a patrol shift. It was supposed to be a routine day. At approximately 1:00 p.m., Potter and her trainee pulled over a white Buick for expired registration tabs and an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The driver was Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old black man who lived in Minneapolis. Wright had moved to the area from Chicago and was working retail and fast food jobs to support his almost 2-year-old son. He had enrolled in a vocational school and was trying to build a life for himself and his child. Wright had a history of minor legal troubles, including the outstanding warrant for a gross misdemeanor weapons charge, but he was not considered a dangerous criminal. Potter approached the vehicle and asked Wright for his driver's license and proof of insurance. Wright complied. Potter ran his information through the system and discovered the outstanding warrant. She informed Wright that he was under arrest. Officers asked him to step out of the vehicle and attempted to handcuff him. Wright initially complied, but as the handcuffs were being placed on him, he became agitated. He pulled away from the officers and tried to get back into the driver's seat of his car. Potter's trainee and another officer struggled to restrain him. Potter reached for her weapon. She believed she was reaching for her taser, a less lethal device designed to incapacitate a suspect with an electrical charge. Tasers are typically carried on the opposite side of an officer's duty belt from their firearm to prevent exactly the kind of confusion that was about to occur. Potter's taser was bright yellow, made of plastic, and weighed 0.94 pounds. Her Glock 9mm pistol, by contrast, was entirely black, partially made of metal, and weighed 2.17 pounds when loaded. The two weapons felt different, looked different, and were carried in different locations. But in the chaos of the moment, Potter made a fatal error. She drew her pistol, thinking it was her taser. She pointed it at Wright and yelled, "Taser! Taser! Taser!" The warning was standard procedure. Officers announce when they are deploying a taser so that other officers know what to expect and can adjust accordingly. But Potter was not holding a taser. She was holding her gun. For 5.5 seconds, she held the weapon, her finger on the trigger. And then she fired. The bullet struck Daunte Wright in the chest. He was still in the driver's seat, partially in the car. The shot caused him to slump over. His foot hit the accelerator, and the car lurched forward. Wright's vehicle traveled approximately 470 feet down the street before colliding with another vehicle near the intersection of 63rd Avenue North and Catherine Drive. The car came to a stop. Wright was unresponsive. Paramedics were called, but there was nothing they could do. Daunte Wright was pronounced dead at the scene. Back at the site of the traffic stop, Kim Potter's body camera captured the immediate aftermath. She was still holding the gun, now holding it with her left hand, along with a piece of paper. She looked at the weapon in disbelief. "Oh, shit, I just shot him," she said. Then she fell to the ground, collapsing to the curb. "I grabbed the wrong fucking gun," she sobbed. She placed her head in her hands and began to cry. "I'm going to prison. I just killed a boy." The incident occurred just 10 miles away from where Derek Chauvin's trial for the murder of George Floyd was taking place. The timing could not have been worse. The Minneapolis metropolitan area was already on edge, with massive protests and intense scrutiny on police conduct. The killing of another young black man by police, even if it was a mistake, reignited the anger and grief that had been simmering for months. Protests erupted in Brooklyn Center that night. Demonstrators clashed with police. The unrest continued for days. The community demanded answers, and the Wright family demanded justice. Daunte Wright's mother, Katie Wright, spoke to reporters and described receiving a phone call from her son during the traffic stop. She said she had overheard what sounded like a scuffle and an officer saying, "Daunte, don't run," before the phone hung up. She later saw her son's body over FaceTime at a hospital, a traumatic image that would haunt her. Katie Wright said her son had told her he was being pulled over for having an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror. The minor traffic violation that led to his death seemed senseless. Kim Potter was arrested 2 days later on April 14, 2021, and charged with second-degree manslaughter. She resigned from the Brooklyn Center Police Department. Brooklyn Center Police Chief Tim Gannon also resigned after stating in a press conference that he believed the shooting was an accidental discharge. The characterization of Wright's death as an accident infuriated the community and the Wright family. Accidents suggest no one is at fault, but Daunte Wright was dead because an officer with 26 years of experience had confused her gun for her taser. Potter's trial began in December 2021. The prosecution argued that Potter's actions constituted criminal negligence. As a 26-year veteran and field training officer, she should have known the difference between her taser and her firearm. The weight, the feel, the appearance, all were different. Potter had been trained on the dangers of weapon confusion. She had completed certifications, and yet she had made a fatal error. The prosecution presented body camera footage that showed Potter holding her gun for 5.5 seconds before firing. That was enough time, they argued, for her to realize her mistake. The defense argued that Potter had made an honest mistake in the heat of the moment. They portrayed Wright as the aggressor, noting that he had pulled away from officers and was trying to flee in his vehicle. They argued that Potter had acted reasonably under the circumstances, believing she was deploying a less lethal weapon to stop a fleeing suspect. Defense attorneys emphasized Potter's decades of service, her lack of prior disciplinary issues, and her immediate remorse after the shooting. They called her actions an unintentional crime and argued that she should receive probation, not prison. On December 23, 2021, the jury found Kim Potter guilty of first-degree manslaughter and second-degree manslaughter. The verdict was swift. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Potter showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. Her bail was revoked, and she was taken into custody. For the Wright family, the conviction was a measure of accountability, but the sentencing phase would determine whether Potter would face real consequences. Minnesota sentencing guidelines recommended approximately 7 years in prison for first-degree manslaughter for someone with no prior criminal record. State prosecutors sought the presumptive sentence of 86 months, roughly 7 years and 2 months. They argued that the sentence should reflect the seriousness of Daunte Wright's death and Potter's culpability in causing it. Alternatively, prosecutors offered a recommendation for 1 year in jail and 10 years of probation, during which Potter would speak to law enforcement agencies about the dangers of weapon confusion. Potter's defense attorneys asked for probation and time served. They cited her age, her exemplary career, and her lack of prior criminal history as reasons for leniency. They argued that Potter posed no risk of recidivism and that she had already expressed remorse and apologized to the Wright family. They also warned that Potter would be a walking target in prison due to her status as a former police officer. On February 18, 2022, Hennepin County Judge Regina Chu held the sentencing hearing. Members of Daunte Wright's family gave victim impact statements. Katie Wright, Daunte's mother, addressed the court. She did not mention Potter by name, instead referring to her as the defendant. "I will never be able to forgive you for what you've stolen from us," she said. "A police officer who's supposed to serve and protect took so much away from us." Katie criticized Potter for failing to render aid immediately after the shooting. "Please keep in mind, the impact this has caused her family and herself is just a small storm that's going to pass compared to our life sentence without Daunte." Daunte's father, Arbui Wright, spoke next. "I feel cheated. I feel hurt," he said. "They were so tied up into her feelings and what's going on with her that they forgot about my son being killed." Diamond Wright, Daunte's sister, said, "I never thought that my brother would be killed by the same people we are supposed to feel protected by." China Whitaker, the mother of Daunte's son, said Potter had taken away her son's best friend. 7-year-old Gianna, who appeared by video, said she asks about her father all the time and misses him. Potter's mother, Carolyn Paulenti, also spoke. She called her son a good man. "Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man," she said, mistakenly calling Potter by a male name, or perhaps confusing her statement with Derek Chauvin's case, which had occurred in the same courthouse a year earlier. Paulenti said her family supported Potter 100%, and that Potter's life had been destroyed by the incident. "When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me," she said. Potter herself gave a brief statement, sobbing through her remarks. "To the family of Daunte Wright, I am so sorry that I brought the death of your son, brother, father, uncle, grandson, nephew, and the rest of your family to your home," she said. "Katie, I understand a mother's love, and I am sorry I broke your heart." She acknowledged that she had not looked at the family during the trial, saying, "I didn't believe I had a right to." Judge Chu then delivered her sentence. She sentenced Kim Potter to 24 months in prison, 2 years, with 16 months to be served behind bars and the remaining 8 months on supervised release. It was a significant downward departure from the sentencing guidelines. Judge Chu acknowledged that the sentence was controversial. "I recognize there will be those who disagree with the sentence," she said. "That I granted a significant downward departure does not in any way diminish Daunte Wright's life. His life mattered." Chu said she had received hundreds of letters in support of Potter and had read them all. She called the case one of the saddest cases I have had in my 20 years on the bench. The reaction to the sentence was immediate and intense. The Wright family was devastated. Katie Wright said after the sentencing, "Kim Potter murdered my son. Today the justice system murdered him all over again." Civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who represented the family, said in a statement that the judge's comments at sentencing showed a clear absence of compassion for the victim in this tragedy and were devastating to the family. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, whose office prosecuted the case, said he accepted the judge's decision but acknowledged it was hurtful to the Wright family. "I don't ask you to agree with her decision, which takes nothing away from the truth of the jury's verdict," he said. "I know it is hurtful to loved ones of Daunte Wright. I ask that we remember the beauty of Daunte Wright, to keep his memory in our hearts, and to know that no number of years in prison could ever capture the wonder of this young man's life." Kim Potter served 16 months of her 2-year sentence. On April 24, 2023, she was released from the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee. The Minnesota Department of Corrections released her before dawn at 4:00 a.m. to avoid potential protests and after receiving threats directed at Potter and her family. She was released early in the morning out of an abundance of caution for the safety of Ms. Potter, dock staff, and the security of the correctional facility, according to a dock spokesperson. Potter's supervised release lasted until December 21, 2023, when her sentence officially expired. She is no longer allowed to work as a police officer or carry a firearm. The City of Brooklyn Center settled a civil lawsuit with the Wright family in June 2022, agreeing to pay $3.25 million. The settlement also required the city to implement police reforms, including implicit bias training for officers. As of late 2024, the training still has not been fully implemented, though the newly elected mayor has said it is in the works. The case of Kim Potter highlights a fundamental question. When does a mistake become a crime? Potter did not intend to kill Daunte Wright. She did not draw her weapon with the intent to shoot him. She believed she was reaching for her taser, but the result was the same. A 20-year-old man was dead. The prosecution argued that Potter's 26 years of experience made her negligence criminal. She should have known better. The defense argued that in the chaos of a rapidly evolving situation, even experienced officers can make mistakes. The sentence, 16 months in prison, was far less than what other officers in similar cases have received. Derek Chauvin, whose trial was happening just 10 miles away when Potter killed Wright, received 22.5 years for murdering George Floyd. Gerald Goins received 60 years for killing Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas in a botched raid based on lies. Nicholas Tartaglione received 4 consecutive life sentences for torturing and killing 4 men. Even Antoinette Frank, who murdered 3 people, including a fellow officer, remains on death row. Kim Potter served 16 months. The disparity raises uncomfortable questions about race, intent, and accountability. Potter is a white woman who killed a black man. She expressed immediate remorse. She cried at the scene and at her trial. She apologized to the Wright family. Does that justify a lenient sentence? Or does it highlight a double standard in how the justice system treats officers who show emotion and remorse, particularly white officers, compared to those who do not? Critics of the sentence argue that Potter's punishment sends a message that some officers' lives and careers matter more than the lives of the people they kill. Supporters of the sentence argue that Potter made a tragic mistake and that her remorse and lack of intent should be considered. But for the Wright family, the sentence felt like a betrayal. Katie Wright said she was dreading Potter's release. She said she suffered a stroke that left her temporarily with blurred vision following the stress of Potter's trial and conviction. Some say I should forgive to be at peace, but how can I? I am so angry. She is going to be able to watch her kids have kids and be able to touch them, she said. I am always scared I am going to forget my son's voice. The body camera footage from Potter's shooting is one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. It shows the immediate realization of what she had done. Oh shit, I just shot him. The disbelief in her voice, the horror, the collapse. I grabbed the wrong fucking gun. I'm going to prison. I just killed a boy. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered emotion, and it became central to her defense. Potter's attorneys argued that her immediate remorse showed she was not a danger to society, that she was a good person who had made a terrible mistake. But Daunte Wright is still dead. His son will grow up without a father. His mother will never hold him again. His family will never hear his voice. And Kim Potter is free. She served 16 months. She is barred from law enforcement and from carrying a gun, but she is free to live her life. The contrast is stark. The disparity is glaring. And for many, it is infuriating. The case also raises questions about police training and the design of police equipment. Why are tasers and firearms carried on the same belt? Why aren't there more safeguards to prevent weapon confusion? Why isn't the training more rigorous? Potter had completed her taser certification just over a month before the shooting. She had been trained on the differences between her taser and her gun. And yet, in the moment, she confused them. If a 26-year veteran can make that mistake, what does that say about the training? What does it say about the system? The death of Daunte Wright also highlighted the dangers of minor traffic stops. Wright was pulled over for expired registration tags and an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror. These are minor infractions. They do not pose a threat to public safety. And yet, the stop escalated to an arrest attempt, a struggle, and a fatal shooting. Advocates for police reform have called for ending pretextual stops, traffic stops for minor violations that serve as a pretext for searching for drugs or outstanding warrants. Wright's death became an example of how such stops can turn deadly. The Brooklyn Center City Council passed a resolution in 2021 named after Daunte Wright and Kobe Dimmock Heisler, a 21-year-old man with autism who was also killed by Brooklyn Center police in 2019 after his family called 911 for help. The resolution prohibits officers from making arrests or conducting searches for many lower-level offenses, including non-moving traffic infractions like the ones Wright was stopped for. The goal is to prevent minor encounters from escalating into violence. But for Katie Wright, no amount of policy change can bring her son back. She said she is always scared she will forget Daunte's voice. She said she was dreading Potter's release and is struggling to find peace. I am so angry, she said. The anger is understandable. The grief is immeasurable. And the sentence, 16 months, feels inadequate. Kim Potter is now living in Wisconsin, according to her attorney. She has no plans to return to Minnesota. She will not work in law enforcement again. She will not carry a gun. But she is free, and Daunte Wright is gone. The name Kim Potter will be remembered alongside the name Daunte Wright. For some, Potter represents a tragic mistake, a good officer who made a fatal error and paid a price for it. For others, Potter represents a system that is too quick to forgive, too willing to see the humanity in white officers while ignoring the humanity of black victims. The truth, as always, is complicated. But one fact remains simple. Daunte Wright should still be alive. Case 10, Sean Grayson. On the night of July 6, 2024, Sonia Massey was afraid. The 36-year-old black mother of two was alone in her home in Springfield, Illinois, and she believed someone was prowling around her property. She did what she had been taught to do. She called 911. She asked for help. 2 deputies from the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office responded to her call. One of them was Sean Grayson, a deputy with a troubling history of job hopping, 6 different law enforcement agencies in just 4 years. The deputies entered Massey's home to check for intruders. They found no one, but as they prepared to leave, Massey went to her kitchen to turn off a pot of boiling water on her stove. What happened next was captured entirely on body camera footage. Grayson threatened to shoot Massey in her face. When she responded by saying, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus," he drew his firearm and did exactly what he had promised. He shot her in the face beneath her eye. Sonia Massey died in her own home, killed by the very person she had called for protection. Sean Grayson's law enforcement career was marked by instability. In just 4 years, he had worked for 6 different agencies. Job hopping in law enforcement is often a red flag. Officers who move frequently from department to department are sometimes doing so because they have been fired, have faced disciplinary issues, or are one step ahead of investigations into their conduct. Grayson's pattern of moving from agency to agency should have raised concerns. But on the night of July 6, 2024, he was a deputy with the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office, wearing a badge and carrying a gun. Sonia Massey was 36 years old. She was a mother of 2 children. She lived in a modest home in Springfield, a city of about 114,000 people in central Illinois. Massey had called 911 around 12:50 a.m. to report a possible prowler near her residence. She was scared. She wanted police to check her property and make sure she was safe. Deputies Sean Grayson and another officer were dispatched to her address. The deputies arrived and conducted a search of the exterior of Massey's home. They walked around the property with flashlights, checking for signs of an intruder. They found nothing. No prowler, no evidence of forced entry, no signs of danger. The deputies then spoke with Massey, who was inside her home. Body camera footage shows the deputies entering the residence and talking with Massey in a calm manner. The situation appeared to be de-escalating. The deputies were preparing to leave. Massey then walked to her kitchen. She noticed a pot of water on the stove that was boiling. She moved to the stove to turn it off and remove the pot. Grayson and the other deputy were standing in or near the kitchen, watching her. As Massey picked up the pot of boiling water, Grayson reacted with alarm. He told her to put the pot down. Massey, holding the pot, said something that seemed to confuse or irritate Grayson. The body camera footage captures the exchange. Grayson said, "I'll shoot you in your fucking face." It was a threat. It was specific, and it was terrifying. Massey, standing in her own kitchen holding a pot of water, looked at the deputy and responded, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." It was a religious phrase, a way of invoking God's protection against evil or danger. Massey may have been frightened. She may have been trying to diffuse the situation with prayer. She may have simply been expressing her faith in a moment of fear. But Sean Grayson took her words as a threat. He drew his firearm. He aimed at Sonia Massey, and he fired. The bullet struck her in the face, just beneath her left eye. Massey collapsed to the floor. Blood poured from the wound. The other deputy immediately called for medical assistance. Body camera footage shows the aftermath. Massey was on the ground, mortally wounded. Grayson stood over her, his gun still drawn. He did not render aid. He did not attempt to save her life. Instead, he told the other deputy not to waste medical supplies on her because there's nothing we can do. And the wound was a headshot. Paramedics arrived and attempted to treat Massey, but the injury was catastrophic. Sonia Massey was transported to a hospital where she was pronounced dead. She had called 911 for help. She had invited officers into her home to make her feel safe. And she had been killed in her own kitchen by a deputy who had threatened to shoot her in the face and then followed through on that threat. The body camera footage of the shooting was not immediately released to the public, but it was reviewed by investigators and prosecutors. The video was damning. It showed that Massey had not posed a threat to the deputies. She had been holding a pot of water, not a weapon. She had been standing several feet away from Grayson, and Grayson had escalated the situation by threatening to shoot her. When Massey invoked Jesus, Grayson had interpreted it as defiance or a threat and had opened fire. On July 17, 2024, Sean Grayson was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated battery with a firearm, and official misconduct. The first-degree murder charge indicated that prosecutors believed Grayson had intended to kill Sonia Massey. It was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was a deliberate act. Grayson was arrested and held without bond. He was fired from the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office, and the community of Springfield erupted in outrage. Sonia Massey's family held a press conference with their attorneys, civil rights lawyers Ben Crump and Antonio Romanucci. They described Sonia as a loving mother who had struggled with mental health issues but was not dangerous. They said she had called 911 for help and had been killed for it. Sonia Massey called the police for help, Crump said. She needed protection. Instead, she was executed in her own home. The family demanded justice. They demanded that Grayson be held accountable, and they demanded that the body camera footage be released so the public could see what had happened. The case drew national attention. Sonia Massey's death became another name in a long list of Black Americans killed by police in their own homes. Breonna Taylor had been killed in her apartment in Louisville, Kentucky in 2020 during a botched raid. Tatiana Jefferson had been killed in her home in Fort Worth, Texas in 2019 when an officer shot her through a window. Botham Jean had been killed in his apartment in Dallas, Texas in 2018 by an off-duty officer who claimed she thought it was her own apartment. And now Sonia Massey had been killed in her kitchen in Springfield, Illinois, by a deputy who had threatened to shoot her and then did. In August 2024, the body camera footage was released to the public. The video was difficult to watch. It showed Massey in her home, vulnerable and afraid. It showed Grayson's aggression and his threat. It showed Massey's invocation of Jesus, and it showed the shooting. The footage left no room for interpretation. Grayson had shot Massey without justification. The release of the video intensified calls for accountability. Grayson's trial began in October 2024. The prosecution presented the body camera footage and argued that Grayson had committed first-degree murder. They said he had threatened to shoot Massey, and when she responded with a religious phrase, he had followed through on that threat. The prosecution argued that Grayson's actions showed intent to kill. He had not fired a warning shot. He had not used less lethal force. He had aimed at her face and pulled the trigger. The defense argued that Grayson had feared for his life. They claimed that Massey had been holding a pot of boiling water which could have been used as a weapon. They argued that when Massey said, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus," Grayson had interpreted it as a threat, a sign that she was about to attack him. The defense also presented evidence that Grayson had not been adequately trained to handle situations involving individuals with mental health issues. They portrayed the shooting as a tragic but justified response to a perceived threat. On October 24, 2024, after nearly 12 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Sean Grayson was found guilty of second-degree murder, aggravated battery with a firearm, and official misconduct. The jury had opted for the lesser charge of second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder. Second-degree murder in Illinois applies when a person kills another while believing their actions are justified, but that belief is unreasonable. The jury had found that Grayson had genuinely believed he was in danger, but that belief was not reasonable given the circumstances. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a measure of accountability. Grayson had been convicted and would face prison time. Others, including the Massey family, were devastated. They had hoped for a first-degree murder conviction which would have carried a longer sentence. Sonia's father, James Wilburn, said he felt the second-degree verdict was a slap in the face. He showed no remorse. He was so cocky throughout this whole trial until he was convicted, Wilburn said. Yeah, that knocked the smirk off. Attorneys Ben Crump and Antonio Romanucci, who represented the Massey family in a civil case that resulted in a $10 million settlement, said they believed Grayson's actions warranted a first-degree murder conviction, but that the verdict was still a measure of justice for Sonia Massey. Sante Massey, one of Sonia's cousins, said outside the courthouse, "I'm fueled by rage right now. If you get an officer who says he's going to shoot you in the face, and then he shoots you in the face, and you only get second-degree murder?" Under Illinois law, second-degree murder carries a sentence of 4 to 20 years in prison. Grayson is likely eligible for day-for-day credit for good behavior, meaning he could end up serving only half his sentence. If the judge sentences him to the minimum of 4 years, he could be released in as little as 2 years. If the judge sentences him to the maximum of 20 years, he could serve as little as 10. The Massey family has expressed hope that the judge will give Grayson the maximum sentence. The sentencing hearing has not yet been scheduled as of late 2024. The case of Sean Grayson raises troubling questions about how officers with problematic histories are able to move from department to department. Grayson had worked for 6 different law enforcement agencies in just 4 years. That kind of job hopping is highly unusual and often indicates that an officer has been fired or asked to resign from previous positions. Yet Grayson was able to continue finding work in law enforcement. Why weren't background checks more thorough? Why didn't any of the departments that hired him see his employment history as a red flag? And how many other officers like Grayson are out there moving from agency to agency, one step ahead of accountability? The case also highlights the importance of body cameras. Without the body camera footage, Grayson might have claimed that Massey had attacked him with the pot of boiling water and that he had fired in self-defense. His word against a dead woman's. But the body camera footage told the truth. It showed that Massey had not attacked him. It showed that Grayson had threatened her. And it showed that he had shot her after she invoked Jesus. The footage was incontrovertible evidence. It was the reason Grayson was convicted. But the body camera footage also showed something else: Grayson's callous disregard for Sonia Massey's life. After shooting her, he did not render aid. He told the other deputy not to waste medical supplies. He stood over her as she lay dying, and showed no remorse, no urgency, no humanity. It was a chilling display of indifference, and it was captured on video for the world to see. Sonia Massey's death also drew attention to the dangers faced by people with mental health issues when they interact with police. Massey's family said she had been struggling with mental health challenges. She had been in a vulnerable state when she called 911. She needed help, not aggression. But Grayson had escalated the situation. He had threatened her, and he had killed her. The case became another example of how police officers are often ill-equipped to handle mental health crises, and how those encounters can turn deadly. The Massey family filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Grayson and the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office. In late 2024, the county agreed to a $10 million settlement, one of the largest wrongful death settlements in Illinois history. The settlement was an acknowledgement that Sonia Massey's death should never have happened, but no amount of money could bring her back. Her 2 children would grow up without their mother. Her father would never hear her voice again, and her family would carry the weight of her loss for the rest of their lives. James Wilburn, Sonia's father, said he hopes the judge gives Grayson the maximum sentence. He showed no remorse. He was so cocky throughout this whole trial, Wilburn said. Wilburn described the moment Grayson was convicted. That knocked the smirk off. For the Massey family, the conviction was a step toward justice, but it was not enough. They wanted first-degree murder. They wanted acknowledgement that Grayson had intended to kill Sonia, and they wanted a sentence that reflected the gravity of what he had done. Sean Grayson's sentencing hearing will determine how much time he serves in prison. The Massey family will be there, advocating for the maximum sentence. They will tell the judge about Sonia, about her love for her children, her struggles, her humanity. They will ask the judge to remember that Sonia Massey called 911 for help and was killed for it. And they will ask the judge to send a message that officers who abuse their power will be held accountable. The name Sonia Massey is now part of a tragic list of Black Americans killed by police in their own homes. Her death is a reminder that calling 911 can be dangerous for people of color. It's a reminder that even in your own home, you are not safe from police violence. And it's a reminder that the system still has a long way to go before it truly protects and serves everyone equally. Sean Grayson's case is still ongoing. He has been convicted, but he has not yet been sentenced. The outcome of that sentencing hearing will determine whether he spends a few years in prison or more than a decade. For the Massey family, no sentence will ever be enough. Sonia Massey is gone. Her children will grow up without her, and her death will be remembered as another senseless tragedy, another example of a life cut short by an officer who was supposed to protect and serve. The body camera footage of Sonia Massey's shooting will remain as evidence of what happened that night. It will show future generations exactly how she died. It will show Sean Grayson's threat. It will show Sonia's invocation of Jesus. And it will show the moment a deputy shot a woman in the face in her own home. That footage is a testament to Sonia Massey's life and a condemnation of the system that failed to protect her. Her name will not be forgotten, and her death will continue to fuel the fight for justice and accountability in policing. From New Orleans to Minneapolis, from the 1970s to 2024, these 10 cases reveal an uncomfortable truth. The badge meant to protect has too often been wielded as a weapon. Whether driven by greed, sadism, corruption, or split-second panic, these officers transformed from guardians into predators, leaving dozens of victims and shattered communities in their wake. While some faced ultimate accountability, death row, or life behind bars, others served shockingly brief sentences, raising persistent questions about who truly receives justice in America. The wildly disparate punishments suggest we still struggle to hold law enforcement to the standards they enforce on others. As body cameras proliferate and public scrutiny intensifies, we must ask, are we finally breaking the cycle or simply documenting it better? These victims' names, Kim Groves, George Floyd, Daunte Wright, Sonia Massey, and so many others, demand we do more than remember. They demand we reform. Which of these cases shocked you most? And do you think the sentencing disparities show progress or continued problems in police accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see more deep dives into true crime and justice system cases, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to explore.